Take a look around anywhere in the United States and you'll see an image like this. This is really any town where we have this interesting collection of very well constructed buildings, even paved sidewalks, and a muddy street, along with horse and buggies that are parked nearby. What exactly is this showing us? Well, as I said, this could be any town in the United States in the 1800s, this rapid development, these incredible isolated structures that are in the middle of unique patches of terrain. In today's exploration, we're going to examine this account of strangers in a strange land, and we're going back to that story of the United States. These images that we're looking at are from the town of Ames, Iowa, a town that's grown into a city and is now built around a university, Iowa State University to be exact, although originally it started off as the Iowa Model Farm. How intriguing that we have these pictures and these images that show us this rapid growth of the city. And what about the story of the people that settled the United States? Going beyond one town or one city, we see there are no shortage of images that show us what seem to be a very unique group of people that are immigrating into the United States, or emigrating into the United States, whichever word that we tend to use. And it always surprises me that we have no shortage of many different words to describe the plight of individuals as they move from one place to the other. And I don't think there's going to be any debate that this tends to be a pattern that's been repeated, whether we take official history at face value or our present situation at face value, where we have this process of diaspora and dysphoria. In other words, we have people that are relocating from one place to the other, and as a result, they tend to lose their original identity in doing so. Now, one of the big debates that we have that has endured in the United States is what's the righteousness of these individuals to be able to move from one place to the other? What's the contention that we have? And we forget about the fact that it's many policies that we tend to support for whatever reason that cause many of these situations in the first place, or the fact that we're not to question the policies that cause these relocations. And how exactly were they achieved? If you look at the population of the United States, you see an incredible growth of over 1,000%, if, of course, the population numbers are to be taken at face value from 1800 to 1900, and there's certainly situations that could cause us to question the exact veracity of those numbers. But what about the technology of the 1800s? The sudden leap forward, if you will, especially with the concept of utilizing ships, because that was the main means in which people came from Europe and the rest of the land to settle the United States. That's how we explain this incredible population growth. Yet we have all these images that show us that these ship hulks were used to house people and for military purposes and many other purposes, much as the many structures that we have across the land. But what exactly was really going on? Are we really actually seeing an immigration that was occurring because conditions were difficult in one land and people saw promise in another land? Or was there something else going on entirely? What was really going on with this image that we see here in Long Beach, California from the very early 1900s of the so-called Great White Fleet sailing by? In summary, we have all these images that show us that there was something else going on from what we'd expect to see in the 1800s. We'd expect to see a nation that would be consolidating itself primarily on the East Coast and slowly building up its infrastructure, and then relatively slowly expanding to the West. That's what we'd expect to see. But the official timeline does not support that at all. The official timeline says that essentially the entire United States was settled abruptly, all within that century, and then many of the infrastructure for the cities was built up that's still used today. Go ahead and do your own research. Look up all the primary infrastructure in the United States. Look at the account of how people flowed into the United States. It doesn't matter whether you think it's legitimate or illegitimate, the accounts are all there that indicate that people arrived in vast quantities, different ethnic groups from different portions of the land. And this still continues to this day, although of course it still continues around the land to this day. Why do we have all these images of these ship hulks that are just sitting in the harbor? And no, it's not just simply in places such as San Francisco. We have accounts of ship hulks all over the land. Well, it makes perfect sense. People had to sail from point A to point B, and then they just decided to ditch the ships in the harbor. Really? That's what they really would have done? There's also the abrupt technological advancements that we have with ships in the 1800s. How we went from sailing ships to steam ships to suddenly having the ability to build vast cruise ships of tremendous luxury that were suddenly beyond anything that had been seen for the previous 1,000 years. We also have this overlooked concept of how the old order or the old civilization was abruptly discarded. For example, the samurai culture that was completely wiped aside in the Meiji Restoration. And yet it's not just in Japan where you see this particular account. You see this in other nations where their old social or old military order was abruptly changed. Again, all in the 1800s. For example, the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, the samurai in Japan, and even the old Teutonic Order in what is today Germany. These were old military orders that had once existed and had existed for hundreds of years, and according to the official history, they were essential elements of the institution that preserved the power of these empires or these nation states as they expanded. And yet, for a variety of reasons, although they tend to be similar reasons, these orders were abruptly destroyed. There is one exception, such as the Knights Templar that was destroyed earlier, before the 1800s, and yet it has many of the same story beats. A particular institution as part of a civilization that existed in the past that had grown too powerful and too threatening, and therefore it either had to be destroyed or marginalized. These are the things that if you step back and you look at the overall history in different regions, you see that there tends to be similar stories and similar accounts. And here looking at this image in the wreckage of the USS Monitor, a Civil War ship that was a revolutionary naval technological development. At least that's what the official history would tell us. Is that exactly what it was indeed? Or was it something else? Is it possible that this was technology that was located and salvaged? That we have a completely different account of events that unfolded in the 1800s? That what we really have are strangers in a strange land. People who had been seeking refuge for a long period of time and were now abruptly resettling the land. And that's how we have this explanation for all of these pictures of these ships in these harbors, and these people who just seem to be completely out of place, that they're still learning and understanding the area that they're resettling. Looking at the entire account of the 1800s, we see that the United States goes from being a very irrelevant backwater nation to being a world power. But does the exact history reflect that? Does the United States' ability to deny the Spanish Empire, or actually defeat it in a war, come from real history, or is it something else entirely? Is the actual concept that we have of nation states in the 1800s the exact same concept that we have today of nation states? Well, of course, official historians will tell you no, absolutely not. And going back to the concept of the Great Eastern, the incredible cruise liners that abruptly evolved, it wasn't until the RMS Oceanic was constructed in the very late 1890s that there was even a ship that compared with the Great Eastern. You may recall that Leviathan of a ship that was constructed in the 1850s, and yet nothing even matched it in size and capability until the 1890s, near the end of the century. And then the early 1900s, when the incredible Titanic and the Olympic were rapidly constructed and pushed into service on the seas. Of course, people stay more focused on the actual story of the Titanic. We never question its exact origin. And then the United States abruptly asserting its international power with the so-called Great White Fleet. How interesting that that's the name that they picked, but they painted those ships white, and it was supposed to be to show American naval power at the behest of President Teddy Roosevelt. And you may recall that whenever we have a Roosevelt involved in the United States, that all policies are total successes. There is never a single policy failure, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. Here we have the route of the Great White Fleet as it passed around through ports in the land and showed off the American colors. If you ever watched the movie Charge of the Light Brigade from 1968, a movie that's supposed to showcase the power of the British Empire from the mid-1800s, there's an interesting series of images that gives us the impression that there is something else going on. And in the opening credits of the film Charge of the Light Brigade from 1968, you'll see these unique animations that give the impression of this rapid development of industry. And of course, the official historical account does support this. We're informed that we had numerous industrial revolutions that occurred, although how the Industrial Revolution started is rather intriguing. We talk about the development of fertilizers. It was the development of fertilizers on our cornfields and our farm fields across the land that enabled this rapid population growth. And on that note of rapid population growth, it's fascinating to me that the population of the United States increased 1,000% from 18 to 1900, but you don't have that exact same situation in Europe when you study the population levels in the years that preceded 1800. For example, if you go from 1000 to 1800. So what exactly is going on with that? One would expect that if population growth were something that was consistent, yes, here we have the Crystal Palace that's featured in the opening credits of Charge of the Light Brigade. And of course it also features the steamship, or rather the incredible revolutionary ship, the Great Eastern, the Leviathan of the Seas. But you would expect to see that there would be population everywhere in Europe. You would expect it to be a Ecumenopolis, every square inch of land completely covered with an urbanized area. Or at a bare minimum, at least the rivers, because people who support the official accounts say that rivers were your primary highways. Fair enough. Then why do you not have cities that are built in a linear fashion that match the rivers? And I never really thought about this when I watched the Charge of the Light Brigade before I had the eyes that I do now, or the awareness that I do now. That in the opening credits of this film, they're featuring all these stunning technological and industrial developments of the 1800s. I wanted to look into the account of a couple individuals who lived in the 1800s, starting with the Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. Now, Beauregard's an interesting individual because his official lifespan from really the 1820s, he was born in 1818, to the 1890s. He was a Confederate Civil War general. But prior to that, he was born and from Louisiana, from a unique group of individuals known as French Creoles, or aristocrats. And he came from Louisiana and was affiliated with the great city of New Orleans. A very interesting individual because you look at different images of him, whether they're the official pictures or the paintings, and it seems to depict an individual who had quite an interesting life. Now, Beauregard's intriguing because he attended West Point, the United States Military Academy. And at this particular time when he went to West Point, the main focus of training was not just in military tactics, it was also in military engineering. And apparently this is the origin for all of these projects that we have for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that endures to this day. Whether we have an incredible infrastructure project, some isolated dam in a place like Iowa, people like General Beauregard were responsible for it. Now, we'll talk about Beauregard's very interesting Civil War service here in a moment, but when you look at these different images, it almost gives you the impression that there was an individual who went through some unique phases of their life. Do we have the true biography, though, of P.G.T. Beauregard? And Beauregard is famous for being the Confederate commander who fired the shots on Fort Sumter in South Carolina in Charleston Harbor, this being the event that really started the United States Civil War. Now you can look at the background of the history, or if you're so inclined, you can watch Ken Burns' The Civil War and see the many hours devoted to it. Beauregard had served earlier in the United States Army in the Mexican War. In the 1840s, when the United States military conducted its first successful expeditionary operation. And a lot of people would title it as a war of aggression to the South, where the United States imposed its will on Mexico to seize lands as part of Manifest Destiny. In these images, we're looking at the great Chapultepec Castle, which stands today in Mexico City. A very, very difficult obstacle for the United States military to overcome to seize Mexico City. And yet, despite the fact that it was built on a hill and considered to be a very difficult to assault fortress, the United States military managed to pull it off. And the official explanation given, because many of its officers, Beauregard, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and many of the other military officers that would go on to fame in the United States Civil War were trained as civil engineers at West Point. How intriguing that was part of the course construction. And you can go to Chapultepec Castle to this day and see the incredible greatness and the detail of old world construction. And really, I'm amazed that this particular structure did survive the Mexican War between the United States and Mexico. Because you'll see that in the Civil War, many, many cities met their untimely demise. And it's incredible looking at the interior construction of Chapultepec Castle. And when exactly was it built? Now, of course, again, the official history of Mexico supports this and the fact that it was settled from 1500 onward. It was the Spanish, and they had the means and the ability to build structures like this because they had an unending pool of forced labor, and that's how we explain these structures of incredible architecture and artistic appeal. And of course, they had a very long timeline to do it. And it's the same explanation that's given for those incredible cathedrals that are over in Europe in vast quantity. For example, a lot of people tend to be unaware that there was a civil war going on in Mexico in the 1850s. And then there was a French intervention in the 1860s where they decided to install an Austrian guy, not Arnold Schwarzenegger, as the emperor in the 1860s. Again, it reinforces this notion that there was all sorts of conflict that was going on. I have to say that whoever and whatever images that we have from the earlier 1800s, the incredible ornate detail of the uniforms is rather remarkable. There's also the fact that we have all this international intervention that's occurring all through the 1800s, as though sending some sort of expeditionary force overseas really wasn't all that difficult, even though, as we understand it, the ability to project military power in the past was a lot more difficult. Oh, sure, you could take a sailing ship and send an expedition somewhere, but it tended to be a rather small expedition, just a few hundred soldiers or Marines. Now back to Beauregard. Beauregard ran for mayor of New Orleans, and he was in fact responsible for restoring the condition of this custom house. Ah, yes, another one of these post office custom houses. And you may recall during the exploration of New Orleans on this channel that we explored this incredible structure. Someone would probably hand wave it away as, it's simple neoclassical architecture, it's Roman Greco, and that's how we explain everything. Yes, nothing to do with Rome and Greece, a structure that was built in New Orleans and Louisiana in the 1800s. And P.G.T. Beauregard, that American army who would become a Confederate general, was trained at West Point in the Corps of Engineers, or the engineer techniques of civil engineering, and he managed to restore the structure. It still stands today in New Orleans, and you can visit it and appreciate the incredible detail behind it. And I think that's what's really intriguing, though, looking at the life of P.G.T. Beauregard and how he was an Army officer for the United States, trained in civil engineering, and he even dabbled in politics. Did you know that he decided to run for mayor of New Orleans in 1858? And at that time, he was running as part of the Reform Party, but he was defeated by another candidate, a candidate from that nativist party called the Know Nothing Party. Yes, you may recall that interesting political party that just abruptly disappeared. One day it was there, and the next day it wasn't. One day they were able to win mayor elections and run for president, and then they didn't. But beyond that, we go to Beauregard's fame in winning the first Battle of Bull Run, the first major land engagement of the United States Civil War, although not the first land battle, and this was a Confederate victory. Although Beauregard was teamed up with Confederate General Johnson, and he was the one given credit for the battle, Johnson, not Beauregard. Even though Beauregard had achieved the victory and had achieved fame by firing on Fort Sumter and forcing the federal garrison there to surrender. It's really intriguing when you look at these images of the Civil War, so much artwork utilized to display and depict an event that we had photography. Beauregard fell out of favor with the Southern Confederacy and President Davis, and as a result he was relegated to harbor defense duties. And yet he showed great creativity, favoring the development of submarines and mines and technology that seemed to be quite ahead of its time. Beauregard did manage to redeem himself in a way in the eyes of Southerners when he pulled off the successful defense of Petersburg late in the Civil War in 1864 from Grant's overland campaign. The official account says that he conducted this defense with boys and old men and many wounded soldiers, managing to keep the Union Army at bay until Lee's army could arrive to defend it. Beauregard was also responsible for technological developments, the cable car, or the streetcar as they called it in New Orleans. It's interesting to me how we have so many different names for the same technology. Is it a streetcar? Is it a trolley? And yet we see the remnants of this technology to this day. Beauregard even has a registered patent for the development and use of the streetcar, as though we seem to have a more capable technology that made sense with the facilitation of transportation around the city. I remember listening to all the Dean Kamen technological speeches about the development of the Segway in the 2000s, talking about how traveling the last mile in the city were broken because of the fact that cars were not applicable. But if you have a mass transit system, then suddenly it changes everything, doesn't it? And why is it that we still have cities in the United States today that don't have a applicable mass transit system? And so we have this whole biography with P.G.T. Beauregard. And as a Southern general, he was one of the few who seemed to suggest grand strategy to actually defeat the Union. Something else I found interesting. Robert E. Lee was considered the grand tactician of Southern forces, but his strategy was never really that successful. Now, you may be wondering, with Mexico and the United States in civil war, certainly Canada escaped conflict in the mid-1800s. But that's not true. In Canada, after the United States Civil War, in fact, right after it in 1866, you had these events called the Fenian Raids. The Fenian Raids involving these Irish individuals, both North and South, who decided to attack Canada. How interesting. And it's remembered in Canada to this day, along with many monuments and many images. This almost looks like the Grand Parade and Pass and Review at the end of the United States Civil War, but that's an image from Canada. Now, going back to the United States Civil War, I wanted to talk about this particular individual who, for some reason, escapes note in popular history, and that being Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, the great United States Army cavalry commander from New Jersey and another West Pointer, although he came a little later than Beauregard. And I always find his images quite intriguing because if you hear the term Yankee Doodle Dandy, for some reason, this particular individual, Kilpatrick, comes to mind. Now, he went to West Point about a good 30 years after Beauregard did, and was actually there in the 1850s, during a time when George Armstrong Custer attended West Point. And if you look up the biography of George Armstrong Custer, Custer's Last Stand, the worst qualities of Custer are reflected in Judson Kilpatrick to a factor of 10, I would say. Now, if you look at Kilpatrick's biography, it stated that he was a very successful cavalry commander. He won many great victories, although I think those were all moral or political victories, because when you actually look at his battle record, every single battle he participated in tended to be a Union defeat. In fact, if you didn't know his background and that he was from New Jersey, you might actually think he was a Confederate general. Even at the Battle of Gettysburg, which was a Union victory, the last military event was Kilpatrick sending a cavalry force led by General Farnsworth, Elon Farnsworth, another contemporary of Custer, to lead a hopeless cavalry charge against the Confederate forces, which they easily defeated. It even led to the death of General Elon Farnsworth. And yet, for whatever reason, Judson Kilpatrick was not really criticized for this. At least, there was nothing that was held against him. It's rather intriguing, though, to see that there was this very ineffective Union general that was active throughout the entire war, Judson Kilpatrick, and we have the Dahlgren Affair. Now, the Dahlgren Affair was the raid that Judson Kilpatrick commanded himself. He was given the derisive nickname Kill Cavalry by his own soldiers because they saw him as just some sort of glory-seeking fool who was sending soldiers and horses to their untimely demise. The Dahlgren Affair, though, is something that curiously is not mentioned much in popular culture, and it's certainly not mentioned much in Ken Burns' Civil War. And this resulted in a cavalry raid led by Kilpatrick himself. Colonel Dahlgren was one of his subordinates that, while he was on a raid in hostile territory, he decided to detach his command. They were attempting to liberate prisoner of war camps and free Union prisoners that had been held there in what were reported to be terrifying, cramped conditions. And of course, they were quite malnourished. Now, as you can imagine, given the fact that this is Kilpatrick and his victories, military victories, were never really known, this raid failed. And it failed rather spectacularly. For example, nearly a quarter of Kilpatrick's command was destroyed. 1,000 troopers were captured. So rather than liberating these prisoner of war camps, he actually added many prisoners to them. And as if it wasn't bad enough, his subordinate, Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren, who bears a striking resemblance here to Alexander Draymond from Last Kingdom fame, he was captured, or rather he was killed, and then his body was put on display by the Confederates. And why did the Confederates show him such venom? Well, the main reason being, oh yes, and on the note, I remember when The Last Kingdom was a good TV show, and then, I just kind of lost interest in it. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the fact that it was picked up by Netflix. I'm not suggesting that the show became bad once it was on Netflix, just that I sort of lost interest in it. I don't know, maybe I just would have preferred the book. But going back to the Dahlgren affair, oh, yes, and it's also interesting to me how now looking at 54th Massachusetts and Robert Gould Shaw images I see now bears a striking resemblance to Matthew Broderick. I don't recall those images looking that way before, but again, I'm just kind of questioning images from the Civil War. But back to the Dahlgren affair. After Dahlgren was captured, there were papers that were found on him that stated that the whole purpose of this raid wasn't just to free prisoners of war, it was to burn Richmond to the ground and to assassinate, or rather kill, the entire government of the Confederacy. And this resulted in an international incident. And an international incident in which the Confederacy felt that it was justified in trying all sorts of behind-the-scenes events to try to bring the war to a favorable conclusion. In fact, the Dahlgren affair is even stated to be one of the reasons for the plan of John Wilkes Booth to assassinate Lincoln and the entire cabinet. What's intriguing to me, though, is that the Dahlgren affair is a detailed example of orders that talked about destroying cities. Now, of course, the Union denied the Dahlgren affair. They said that the orders found on Dahlgren were not genuine. In fact, his name was misspelled on them. Yet other Union officers, such as Major General Patrick here, what an interesting looking individual, with the Bureau of Intelligence, verified that there were orders to destroy Richmond and to capture or kill the entire Confederate government. What an interesting conflicting account this is. And if this was in fact genuine, then suddenly it verifies and justifies the response by the Confederate government. And it's really intriguing when you look at how the perspective of the Civil War in the United States changed both before and after Ken Burns' Civil War, which was released in 1990. You'll find many examples of sympathetic portrayals of the Confederacy in many pop culture shows prior to 1990. Some examples include North and South, Little House on the Prairie, where the James brothers are actually shown in a sympathetic light, and even in Looney Tunes. If you recall the particular episode where Tweety Bird and Sylvester are playing out their little Civil War story, and Tweety Bird is from the Confederacy. But again, these images show us this city-wide destruction that occurred during the Civil War. And this was supposed to happen during cavalry raids. And it's rather intriguing when you think about this rather brash Union cavalry commander, Judson Kilpatrick, who never really won a battle, but he was famed for the victories that he achieved in destroying cities. And he was despised by the Confederacy. And because of the failure of Dahlgren's, or rather the Dahlgren affair, the raid to rescue prisoners of war, he was no longer welcomed in the Eastern Theater. How interesting. But he was welcomed by William Tecumseh Sherman. Yes, the individual who is famed for the Georgia campaign, the Atlanta campaign, and ultimately the March to the Sea in Savannah, where much of the South was destroyed. And we have images that seem to document and corroborate that account. For some unknown reason, he said he wanted a fool, and he admitted that General Kilpatrick was a fool, to command his cavalry. I guess he wasn't looking for anybody to win military victories, because that's not what Kilpatrick did. But what Kilpatrick seemed to do was cause a wide swath of destruction. And maybe if things went wrong on the campaign, he was an individual to blame. Who knows? I mean, again, I'm just trying to decipher the official history from all of this. I also find it rather curious that Kilpatrick and that cavalry charge is not featured in Gettysburg, and it's really not even talked about in Ken Burns' The Civil War. I mean, it kind of destroys the entire drama of Pickett's charge if that's not the last event of the Battle of Gettysburg. Kilpatrick is remembered, though, and you'll find him on numerous markers across Georgia as being one of General Sherman's lackeys who was all about destroying things across the South. But again, recall that Kilpatrick was not a very successful cavalry commander. Like I said, it's very hard to find a battle he actually won. And even when he was off on his great raiding mission across the South in South Carolina, he was actually surprised. And he was surprised because he had neglected to post security, and during an evening when he was on one of his raids, he was hooking up with one of his mistresses in a house when the Confederates surprised them. Fortunately, they didn't capture Kilpatrick because he said, "Look, he's riding off that way. I am not General Kilpatrick." Obviously, he doesn't stand out because he's not a very tall individual, and he has that very interesting facial hair. So somehow, for some reason, the Confederates were unable to capture him despite having him within their grasp. He subsequently lost the Battle of Aiken in South Carolina, which is still commemorated in South Carolina to this day as a reflection of how they were able to stand up against the Union. Maybe if Kilpatrick would have been up to winning a battle or two, that battle wouldn't be commemorated in South Carolina today. So why is it that this individual, who never won any battles, was under arrest several times for profiteering off of what was going on in the war and caused an international incident, was remembered and never called out for his inability to win battles? And why did a guy whose reputation he was despised by his troopers and by other generals for being completely ineffective, except of course for William Tecumseh Sherman for some unknown reason, why was he able to have a successful military career? It's really strange, especially when we look at the so-called Committee of the Conduct of the War. Yes, you recall this congressional committee that started at the beginning of the Civil War that questioned many Union generals and their ineffectiveness in combat. Well, for some reason, they never questioned General McClellan, even though he was from a different political party and ran against President Lincoln in 1864, and they certainly never questioned General Kilpatrick, despite the fact that it's hard to find a single battle that he won. I guess he managed to capture a couple Confederate ironclads during a raid, but outside of that, look at every single cavalry battle, and it tends to be a Confederate victory. Even the one battle where they say the Union cavalry showed themselves to be the equal of the Confederate cavalry, it was still a Confederate victory. So I don't know, make of it what you will. And then, after the war, Kilpatrick was appointed as minister to Chile. And he was involved in this little event where the Spanish Empire decided to bombard the city of Valparaiso, an important port city in Chile. And because Kilpatrick was there as the United States minister, he tried to negotiate, utilizing the presence of U.S. naval combat power to dissuade the Spanish from bombarding the city. Well, Kilpatrick was as apt a negotiator as he was a cavalry tactician. Negotiations broke down, and the Spanish bombarded the city. So you can add that to Kilpatrick's list of moral victories. Now, it's intriguing to me to go on from the United States Civil War to the Plains Indian Wars, or the Great Sioux War, the constant conflict that continued between the Native Americans and what was originally, officially, European colonists, settlers, the British, and then the Americans. And this was a long, drawn-out conflict. This was from the very early days of Jamestown in the 1600s and continued all the way, really, until 1900. A lot of people say that the conflict finally ended with the Wounded Knee Massacre. But it's interesting to think about what a no-holds-barred, give-no-quarter constant conflict this had to have been. And it starts all the way back with the Jamestown Massacre, again, according to official history. It's really intriguing, though, when you look at how difficult of a conflict that this was and how this went on for hundreds of years. The subjugation of all the Native American tribes, the complete destruction of the way of life. There was even the Northwestern Indian War, as it was called, that occurred shortly after the American Revolution in the 1790s. And it's odd to me that U.S. military history wasn't always the most forthcoming about mentioning this. Now, in later historical books, this was stated to be a conflict that was essentially rediscovered. Then, of course, there was the uprising of Tecumseh during the War of 1812, where there was an Iroquois confederation and then a subsequent Native American confederation that Tecumseh was somehow going to coordinate and lead. And a lot of historians will say that this was the one time that the Native Americans could have resisted the overcoming and overwhelming force that the United States would eventually bring against them. It's rather interesting to think, though, that the United States Civil War, which different sources conflict, saying that there were over 600,000 casualties. I mean, how many Americans actually died in the Civil War? That's always a difficult number to determine. We think we know exactly what happened. We have this account of the Dakota War in Minnesota, where the Dakota Uprising forced the militia of Minnesota to both engage in an internal conflict while it had forces that were fighting in the United States Civil War. How interesting that a state and a federal government were able to sustain both conflicts. It's even more interesting to me that right after the Civil War ended, where we understand that the South was so depleted in terms of manpower that there were considerations of arming the former slaves and forming them into military units. Now, of course, there are other historical sources that say that's absolutely not true, but everybody does seem to agree that manpower was utterly depleted at the end of the Civil War. And then we have these ongoing Plains Indian Wars that occurred right after the end of the Civil War, and the Great Sioux War in what is today Montana, Wyoming, and of course South Dakota. And here we have the interesting facial hair of W. Cook, who was the adjutant to General George Armstrong Custer, or rather Lieutenant Colonel Custer. And the reason there are so many ranks is because it's a rather confusing time in United States military history. There were multiple military organizations. There was the regular United States Army, there was the United States Volunteers, at least during the Civil War. And everyone knows about the Custer's Last Stand, the defeat of the 7th Cavalry, and while the 7th Cavalry as a formation was not completely destroyed, it was severely attrited with several of its troops or companies being completely destroyed in the event known as Custer's Last Stand. Custer himself is a Kilpatrick sort of general, although he did actually win a few victories during the United States Civil War, and even claimed credit for some victories against the Native Americans initially. Although despite the fact that he had this reputation, he is remembered for the greatest massacre in the history of the United States Army. Interesting fact, though, Custer was not the official commanding officer of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. That was Colonel Samuel Sturgis, pictured here. Yet despite the fact that there was a war going on, and they were attempting to subdue Native Americans, Sturgis was on detached duty in St. Louis as part of a recruiting detachment. How bizarre. How strange that your commanding officer is on detached recruiting duty while your regiment's engaged in combat. That is utterly strange to me. It's very, very hard to fathom. I mean, the only time I can think of any modern U.S. Army unit where its commanding officer wouldn't be present would be a training event. Anything with actual combat, and the commanding officer would always be present. Even looking at the different figures that we have involved in Custer's Last Stand, looking here at the very interesting appearing Captain Benteen, the individual who is considered to be the hero after Custer had divided his command and enabled the Sioux to divide and destroy in detail. And then here we have Major Marcus Reno, a very interesting individual and also a West Pointer. It's really intriguing to me how these West Point graduates went from being the ultimate polymaths of civil engineering to just being simple military tacticians. At what point did that actually happen? And here we have the interesting case of William Jones Nicholson. Now, Major Reno ended his career because he decided to strike a young Lieutenant William Jones Nicholson during the expeditions on the West. And yet William Jones Nicholson never went to West Point. He didn't even go to ROTC, and he was not a direct commission from an enlisted soldier. He was just simply some civilian who the next day they decided to make an officer. The really interesting account with the 7th Cavalry is how the United States seemed to be depleted. Remember that the regiment wasn't completely destroyed. It had lost probably over 50% of its strength, depending on if numbers are to be believed. And yet there seemed to be a struggle to refill its ranks. So what exactly do you think was going on in all these conflicts? Civil War, the Native American conflict that lasted for hundreds of years. Is it as we think, or is it something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments. The incredible post offices that mark the power of the United States. The United States, a nation that defies all expectations, an amalgamation of different cultures and peoples, all built in under a 100-year period, its territories completely defined, cities built where no cities had existed before. And today this nation exists as arguably a hyperpower within international affairs. But what's the real story of the origin behind the United States? How was it its borders were all defined for all of its states by 1874, with the Dakotas being an exception, and the numerous expositions? It even had a national capital constructed, and then it was reconstructed during the Civil War, no less. Join me as we explore the truth of America. The United States of America, the great state. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. We're going to explore the origins of the United States, the world's hyperpower. How did this colonial breakaway from the British Empire become the hyperpower that it is today? Come join me as we explore the American Republic.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
We've extensively explored the United States in our explorations, and we're going to examine this rail map from 1875 when it was composed, and it was originally composed to celebrate the centennial of the United States. And you might be surprised to know that the United States was already completely divided out by 1875 when this map was made, and it includes the United States and the Dominion of Canada at the time. And we can see that it includes the wondrous infrastructure that had to be completed to support the railroad. Everywhere at the same time, the United States was rapidly constructed, and here we see an image of the differing United States Capitol domes, supposedly. It's also intriguing to realize that the geographical definitions of all the states seem to have been defined, and we had many centennials and World's Fairs that had already transpired at this time, according to the official history. We can see that the fine geographical definitions of the states were already established. It's almost as though there was some sort of preconceived plan, and indeed the only states not divided in this map are the Dakotas into North and South Dakota, but everything else is as we know it now. We looked at certain states, such as Georgia, and we consider the early history of Georgia, namely the capital of Atlanta. Atlanta did not exist, really, prior to 1800 at all. It was a rail stop that was suddenly built up, destroyed in the Civil War by the Union Army, and then quickly rebuilt after the Civil War. It's an all too common story that we have. And indeed, most of the cities that we've explored in the United States didn't even exist before 1800, or they were simple settlements or forts, such as Nashville in Tennessee, another city that grew rapidly in the 1800s. And we've explored elsewhere across the eastern United States, such as Louisville, where we've seen wondrous architecture, and again, another city that rapidly developed and grew in the 1800s. And I don't want to forget to mention Cincinnati, one of my favorite explorations, where we saw a city that we're told was made by Germans, and Indianapolis in Indiana, a city that seems to be a terminus point. And of course, who can forget Chicago, where they had the Great World's Fair and several fires. So many cities that developed in the 1800s, to include Milwaukee with this wondrous courthouse and the large convent, visible from the river very easily. And going over to Minnesota and Minneapolis and St. Paul, two cities that grew very quickly. And indeed, many of these cities grew rapidly. We have courthouses, and we have Rochester in Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic developed, and this wondrous courthouse in Austin, Minnesota. Of course, we see the brutalist example that remains to this day. And looking across this map, we can see that all these structures were completed at the same time. State capitals, county courthouses, infrastructure, railways, all done within the 1800s. Our favorite Iowa State Capitol, or at least my favorite, maybe you don't like it, and that's entirely okay. And yet, the presence of Iowa State College at Ames, and yet Ames, Iowa is not depicted on this map, even though it was originally constructed as a rail stop. Very interesting. We go out to Nebraska on the Transcontinental Railroad, and we can see the many communities that were along it, and maybe even see Gene Hackman when he thought he was dead, but he was actually just in Nebraska. I don't have anything against Nebraska. We can see, though, that the Dakotas have no infrastructure depicted in them, no railroads, and yet they rapidly grew. Recall our exploration of Mount Rushmore and Devil's Tower, and seeing the top of Devil's Tower in what is today Wyoming. And even back when this map was constructed, it was very clearly Wyoming. So many interesting things and wondrous achievements in a short 100-year period. And over here on this map, we even have some population figures and railway distribution in terms of how much mileage in each state. It's a very impressive set of achievements that's all illustrated on one map. Remember that the United States was a breakaway colonial possession of the British Empire. There was no reason for this wondrous experiment, at least we're told it was an experiment in government, to suddenly succeed. And not only did it succeed, it rapidly grew in under 100 years. All this infrastructure, all these bridges, all these railroads, all these state capitals, even the U.S. state capitol, the courthouses, and let's not forget the population. And you can certainly go back and look at the population video to see how unprecedented the growth of population in the United States is. Many will try to explain it by simply saying it was because of immigration. We also have our early governors, and some very interesting early governors, such as C.C. Carpenter, the governor of Iowa, in the 1870s. Isn't it intriguing that they wanted to make sure everybody knew who the governor was and what their term was, even during this time frame? And who is the individual who made this map? Gaylord Watson? Did Gaylord Watson appear like Ben Stiller? Because we don't have an image of Gaylord Watson, which I find quite fascinating, and yet this was an official map that was logged in the Library of Congress. So what to make of this impressive map that shows us the incredible achievements of the American Republic in under 100 years. It's very impressive if it's taken at face value. But is this really to be taken at face value? Let's examine what the United States has become. And we went from a backwater colony to the world power, and that's depicted here in the Unified Combatant Command's area of responsibility, where the United States Department of Defense has divided up every geographical area in the known land, the world, the realm, whatever you want to call it, into geographical areas of responsibility, even violating the Posi Comitatus Act, which says that military cannot be used in a law enforcement role, but we're told that U.S. Northern Command was a practical necessity due to matters of national security, and therefore it exists. So regardless of concerns in earlier American times, they have Northern Command. They have a command that encompasses every single geographical area. And the intention behind this is so that there can be a division and a unified chain of command for the employment of American military forces anywhere in the land. Indeed, the United States is the only military in the world that divides up the entire world into geographical areas of responsibility. It's also the only military in the world, as far as we know, that has what's called expeditionary capability, the ability to deploy military forces to any point in the land. They even have a space command area. Now, whatever your opinion on this is quite an amazing change from what was just a group of colonies that was considered a backwater area. And there's even a book that's been written called Flight of the Eagle by this particular individual, Conrad Black, Lord Black, who is considered somewhat controversial himself. But whatever your opinion on the individual, this is the only novel or book that considers the strategy from America's rise. And we look at the founding fathers of the United States, the founding fathers which seem to have even come to a mythical status. And officially we're told the founding fathers were the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the composers of the Constitution, although we specify things a little bit more. We have George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and a few others. Oh, I don't want to forget Alexander Hamilton. But these were the individuals who had these wondrous thoughts of creating a republic, a democracy. Even though things started to change, if we look at the 5 pillars of the original American Republic, we have faith in God, respect for the Bible, sinfulness of human nature, Christian virtue necessary, and government exists to protect faith and freedom. That's very different than the other aspects or perceptions that we have of the modern American state, where we say we believe in the separation of church and state. But of course, we understand that things were very different. People thought and operated very differently at that time. At least that's what we're told. Regardless, though, we have this conflicting account with the nascency of the United States. We also have many of these mythological images and these symbols that are so powerful. Lady Columbia, the Statue of Liberty, Uncle Sam. And yet when you look at a lot of the artwork that we've seen in many of these wonderful structures that were constructed in the United States, we see many mythical impersonations and even what would be considered folk art, such as this image where we see people paying their taxes. And I thought it was very fitting since it's April in the United States, and everyone in the United States knows what April means, unless of course you file for an extension. The symbolism is very interesting though with Lady Columbia and the aspects of innate wisdom. It almost reflects something that we could consider from the Greco-Roman pantheon of deities. Why do we see this so present in the United States? And indeed, in all the state capital explorations that we've done, we've seen some sort of reference to this symbolism, not symbology, but symbolism. And we've even seen it in many county courthouses and in other areas across the land. Indeed, every soldier and sailor's monument that we've looked at shows this symbolism to an extent. But what is this really reflecting? It's almost as though this is pointing back to another period of American history. Now, of course, we'll be told, no, that's not true. It's merely a sign of symbols that alludes to the myth and the folk art that represents what the United States was truly about. Consider the Lewis and Clark expedition. The United States doubled in size when it had the Louisiana Purchase, when it purchased that area from France. And President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark, 2 U.S. Army officers, on an expedition to the Pacific to map out the terrain. Oddly enough, the French, who had been there for hundreds of years, had never bothered to map it out, or perhaps Napoleon didn't want to throw maps in the deal and just wanted to sell the land as fast as he could. Although it's now understood that what selling the land meant was that the United States could actually go and, how shall we say, occupy it, but we'll just call it what it is, conquer it, as there were Native Americans that were there, and we have the account of their guide, Sacagawea. And there were many other guides that supposedly took part in the Lewis and Clark expedition. But what was the real intention behind it? Do you just send a small party to go and explore and actually bypass a lot of the land that you're in, or were they looking for something else? there's a lot of anomalies when you go through this particular path that these individuals traveled on. And what's the real historiosity behind this? Now, there's a lot of debate between the purposes of this expedition. It has been agreed upon, but if you ever go to Montana, you'll find that there's a lot of interesting sites that are there. Now, of course, we'll be told that these are just simple natural rock formations and that Montana is a very beautiful state, and there's certainly no arguing that point. Yet if you ever travel through it, you'll find that there's many of these odd examples with rocks, or rocks that some might be forgiven for thinking are not necessarily built by nature. There's many supposed surviving maps and first-hand accounts of the Lewis and Clark expedition, such as this, well, less than well-kept manner of notes in a map. That gives you the idea of what their expedition was really about and what they were focused on. And then you have other maps that were obviously more well decorated and, how shall we say, well composed, with more effort being put into scientific and accuracy with the distances and the locations and in terms of what they were researching. This is the Sergeant Floyd Memorial, and a very strange obelisk that exists near Sioux City, Iowa. And you might be surprised to know that there is something that is a smaller version of an obelisk of the Great Washington Monument in Sioux City, Iowa. Oddly enough, there's still the little commemoration that we have on it. They call it a shaft, and it's to mark the burial place of Sergeant Charles Floyd of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Died in his country's service, buried 1804. And then we see that graves of such men are pilgrim shrines, no class or creed confined. And it was erected in 1900 by the Floyd Memorial Association, United States and the state of Iowa. Very interesting, again, an almost mythical association with this incredible structure that still exists near Sioux City. They built this in 1900. Well, how come every set of veterans, especially from the Great War and then the War to End All Wars, which is the same war in World War II, didn't get such wonderful monuments such as this? Well, this was Sergeant Floyd from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and I suppose for some reason he deserved a great obelisk, and I'm certainly not denigrating the character of his service. I'm just saying it's a very impressive monument for one single individual. And yet we do have some construction photos of it, if you can call this a construction photo. Maybe you can. There's some peculiarities with it where it shows them allegedly finishing constructing the top of the monument. You'd think there'd be a better quality photo in 1900, but I don't know, maybe they just didn't have a very good camera at that time. And you can see, though, on the early maps at the end of the expedition, they still had Floyd's grave marked. Well, I guess the officers were very fond of this Sergeant Floyd. He really did his job quite well. I think of all the other non-commissioned officers, though, that have lost their lives in the service of the United States. There's many other aspects that reflect the myth and the folk art of the United States from the 1800s, and they give the impression of the concept of what was called manifest destiny. Yes, manifest destiny, apparently a strategic influence or a strategic goal of the United States to settle all the lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's really hard to pinpoint, though, the actual origin of this strategy. You could almost say that it almost seemed preordained, and indeed Manifest Destiny almost says it's preordained. And indeed the individual that coined the term, we don't actually have a picture of him, we just have a sketch drawing of Mr. John O'Sullivan, and I find that very interesting that the individual that coined the term for a mythical strategic expansion westward. And we do have the same kind of symbolism that accompanies it with deities and the overwatching of the settlers as they moved west into areas that were untamed with infinite amounts of resources and land. At least that's what we'll be expected to believe. And it's rather fascinating that on many of these images you'll see trains and tracks, and then you'll also see trains that are traveling across open land without tracks. So is that to give us the impression that they had to build the train tracks rather rapidly, or was it just artistic license? Not really sure, but it's interesting that that's what we have. We have a lot of paintings and a lot of mythology that accompanies this, even though the camera had been invented and was fully in use during the Civil War. Although we always lament our complete lack of combat photographs, that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything, any more than the lack of photographs that really display manifest destiny really prove or disprove anything. Of course, people will say that if you just have an image of a small western town or one of those shack towns of wood in South Dakota, which we've explored and we have some interesting accounts behind, it gives another conflicting account. Ah, yes, Lady Columbia, who can forget, the great deity of the United States. It's very fascinating that we have this Lady Columbia, or the Statue of the Republic as it was called in the Chicago World's Fair in the early 1890s. Once again, almost showing a completely different origin for the United States. Are we to simply take these as national symbols, or was there some other inspiration behind their creation? Why are they so prevalent, especially in buildings? It's one thing to do drawings and paintings of all this, but when you lay out manifest destiny and the fact that all these structures were built very quickly in a short time frame in the 1800s, they all display these symbols. Now, of course, we have our theories that this could potentially represent a different origin for the United States. And perhaps that's what we really have to consider, that there is a different ideological origin. We'll be told that the roots of the American Republic or democracy actually come from the Greek originals, or the practice of democracy in Athens, and even the Roman Republic. And yet, oddly enough, we do see a combination of symbols that give us different indications for what manifest destiny really led to. And indeed, now the United States has a reputation for being a nation of excess, and yet it still claims to defend and support democracy. Here's a chart showing the estimated number of pioneers departing for Oregon, and you might recall our exploration of Seattle, where we saw a very tremendous growth of population within that particular area of the country. The population growth of Seattle from 1860 to 1960. And we're supposed to take this mythological interpretation of paintings and drawings along with these official documents and brochures that encouraged everybody to go west. Because you went through a hard journey to come to the United States from Europe, so you may as well go on another hard journey to go out west and tame this untamed land where there was no existing infrastructure at the time. And indeed, the railroad map is quite limited in terms of how much railway mileage there was in the United States in 1875. Of course, in the next 30 years, they quickly increased that exponentially, and let's not forget our changing of the rail gauge of 11,500 miles of rail in 36 hours. But remember, it was the 1800s. There really weren't any logistical limitations. They managed to build all this infrastructure, all these railways, all of these bridges, and all of these tunnels in a very short amount of time, as the map does indicate. 1776 to 1876. A series of wondrous achievements. A nation that not only was brought about by being a breakaway colony, and consider the wars that this nation fought. The War of 1812, constant conflicts with Native Americans, the Mexican War, and the U.S. Civil War. We saw the United States military struggle quite a bit in the War of 1812, and indeed it frequently struggled in its conflicts with the Native Americans. The legend of the last stand of Custer endures to this day. Somehow they managed to improve, though, in the Mexican War and then in the U.S. Civil War. The point being is that there were a series of very brutal conflicts, and yet it seems that the United States had its strategic mentality in mind, and that the United States Civil War was going to be fought so that the United States could achieve a more perfect democracy, and coincidentally it could also achieve a more centralized government. But let's think about that, because we're told that prior to the United States Civil War that the American states, such as Iowa, Georgia, they were really the representation. It's in the title of the United States. That, in other words, state identity or states' rights were what mattered to people. Well, perhaps the best way to look at that is in flags, and we're told that the United States needed to have a flag in 1777, and here we have George Washington with Betsy Ross approving the original design. But what exactly did the states have in the early period of the United States? So we would expect every single state in the United States to have a state flag, especially once they became a state, but you may be surprised to know that that's not the case. For example, we'll look at Minnesota in 1893, the first Minnesota state flag. In 1893, the Minnesota delegation to the Chicago World's Fair held a contest under the auspices of the state legislature to design a Minnesota state flag. The flag was intended to serve as a promotional tool for the state at its exhibition pavilion in Chicago. Amelia Hyde, Center of Minneapolis, submitted the winning entry. So we have a competition for our state flags, and I'm rather surprised to know that they didn't have a state flag for Minnesota. What about the Civil War? Well, when you look up here on this site, you're told that Minnesota's Civil War battle flags, in keeping with Union customs, several Minnesota regiments carried blue battle flags with a state seal in the center, including the 1st Minnesota, which fought at Gettysburg and endured great casualties, but certainly not because of General Hancock, and the 2nd, 4th, and 5th Minnesota. Most other Minnesota battle flags, however, had the American Eagle at the center by federal regulations. Many of Minnesota's battle flags are today displayed in the Capitol Rotunda. Well, that's Minnesota. Let's look at Iowa. Iowa was one of the primary states of the Union, and sent nearly 10% of its population to fight in the Civil War, the war between the states. What's the origin of its flag? Well, they didn't have their flag until 1921. What? Iowa did not have a state flag until 1921? That's what official history says. There was a false flag that was apparently used by a tobacco company, but it wasn't the real official flag of Iowa. So let me get this straight. Iowa, one of the most, how shall we say, supportive states of the Union, and yet we're told that prior to the Civil War, states' rights and states' identity was so paramount, didn't even have a state flag until the 1920s. They didn't even have one for the World's Fair, and we know that Iowa had some great displays in the Chicago World's Fair, but they didn't have a state flag. How would anybody know about Iowa? Let's look at one of the southern states or former states of the Confederacy and the flag of Georgia. And indeed, you'll find that Georgia didn't actually have a state flag or anything like it until 1861. This is very strange. Well, let's just look at a timeline of all U.S. state flags, and you might be surprised to notice that virtually all of the U.S. states did not have any kind of state flag until the 1860s, which corresponded with the start of the Civil War. And indeed, you'll see that most of the states that did were the states that joined the Confederacy or seceded from the Union. Now, there are some exceptions, such as Hawaii, and maybe a few others. New York, but of course, New York being the original port of entry to the United States and it being around since the 1600s, of course it would have a flag. But for the most part, none of the states had any sort of state flag until the 1860s. This seems to be in contravention towards what we'd expect with the identity of the states in the United States. So what's the point behind all this? The point behind all this is that despite having the paramounts of symbolism, none of the states bothered to have state flags. The United States had to have its flag for the American Revolution, though, but the states supposedly had this great identity, but for the most part, it didn't develop until the 1860s. That seems to give us a very different perception than what we're taught about the identity of the American states. But what are your thoughts on this discrepancy that we found? So let's close this exploration by looking at the works of Erastus Salisbury Field, an American folk painter, and this is supposedly a colorized daguerreotype. Does this really look like any kind of picture to you, though? Very strange, and this individual is considered an American folk painter, and he was primarily active from 1850 to 1870, although the exact datings of his works are quite interesting. What kind of picture does he give us of America? Well, when you look at some of his works, he has a very interesting style of realism mixed with some sort of aspect of idealism. And you're probably asking, all right, why are we looking at an American folk painter? Because folk art is something that it's not necessarily a true reflection of what's actually going on. It's merely showing us exactly what we have in terms of myth. Indeed, we're told that he focused a lot of his works on biblical and classical paintings, such as the Ark depicted here. Now, if we go off the official account, then sure, we could easily believe that, but this individual also painted aspects of American history. And so could this give us the impression that the Ark of the Covenant was in the United States at some point in time? Now, I could simply be leaping to conclusions and there may be no reality behind it, but it's quite an interesting body of work that this Field provided us, or whatever his works was really representing or were representing. This family portrait is rather interesting as well, and seeing some of the humanity in the images and yet some of the idealism. Isn't it intriguing when we think of what our perceptions of the 1800s are really like? And how do we form our perceptions of the 1800s? Well, I hate to say it, but the reality is it's from television shows, it's from certain paintings, and we'll look at folk art such as this. And this is where we'll derive our understanding of history from, because this actually puts it in image. And as we're constantly told, oddly enough by the United States Department of Defense as well, we're all visual learners. And so what are these images really representing? Is this the idealized individual from the 1800s? And indeed, he even did this interesting image that shows George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and some of the great Union generals, I say that with a little bit of sarcasm, from the United States Civil War, because while the military record of Ulysses S. Grant, who's depicted here, some of the other generals depicted on this painting don't exactly have the greatest reputation. Yes, of course, we have the old hand in the pocket. Why not? Very interesting representation, though, of Lincoln and Washington, and not typically how we're used to seeing them. Now, is this supposed to be some sort of real image, or is this just some sort of idealized image? And who do we have over here to the right? Well, this is supposed to be General Ambrose Burnside on the far right. Why is it we always have this reference to Ambrose Burnside? Because his military record during the United States Civil War was anything but remotely close to successful. Indeed, one of the most bloody, horrific Union defeats in the Civil War, the Battle of Fredericksburg, was brought about by this individual. There's also other odd artwork that Mr. Field did, such as the Taj Mahal. Was there a Taj Mahal in the United States, or did he actually travel to India? Well, there's no real account of that, so why would he be doing an artistic rendering or look at the Taj Mahal? And then we look at some of his so-called biblical works, and yet we have another oddity with this, because is he really depicting biblical works? When you look closer at some of the detail behind this, though, there's nothing remotely biblical about this. This almost seems to give the impression of something a little bit more modern, or whatever was actually going on in the 1800s. Could it be that this is reflecting a different view of what truly transpired in the United States? Or again, is it just an ideal? Is it the fact that he really dabbled in different kinds of paintings and decided to do actual biblical representations and depictions, and also of Roman times? This is supposedly the army of the Pharaoh marching off, although how would anybody have any idea what the army of the Pharaoh marching off? And of course you'll tell me, well, he was just using his imagination. Of course he was. And speaking of his imagination, he did have a very unique painting called the Monument to the American Republic. This has to be one of the most unique and creative paintings I've ever seen from the 1800s. Where did this inspiration come from? Is this an amalgamation of different architectural stylings and paintings that he saw? Or does this represent something that may have existed in the United States? And again, I know you'll be saying speculation, but it's rather odd that during a time frame when people were certainly not encouraged to use their imaginations and had to be very pragmatic and very hard workers, because how else do you explain all that incredible infrastructure that was thrown up across the entire United States in under a 100-year period, then where was someone going off with their imagination being able to bring all this together? Or is it possible that this is a depiction of how something looked in the United States in the distant past? These very unique towers with all these columns. We're told that the artist was simply representing different folk art of America and showing American history. But why do they always call it the American Republic? And indeed, looking closer, you can see what's supposed to be historical events that are represented within the walls, on the columns, and yet we also still see the Roman Greco architecture. Well, you can easily hand-wave explain that away by saying, this particular individual, this painter, he liked to depict Roman and Greek origins in many of his paintings. So this doesn't necessarily reflect what was going on in the United States. But isn't it interesting we have such a conflicting account? What are your thoughts on the American Republic? What's the real history? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring some of the mythical or legendary accounts across the land. We're oftentimes informed that the Native Americans were simply a hunter-gatherer society, and yet there's so many more details and so many more dimensions to the accounts of the Native Americans that we're going to consider in this exploration. They seem to be tied a little bit more closely to the land, and there are many more different origin accounts and legends that they possess through their oral traditions. Now, granted, as we explore these oral traditions, we're going to keep in mind that many may not have been transmitted to us directly. I would prefer to actually have a Native American account these lost tales of the old world to us directly, and if there's a demand, we'll do that. But I think there's some wonderful details that we need to consider as we explore the lost tales of the old world. We begin by examining the account of the Seti Ka, or the Siti Ka, there's many ways to pronounce it, a legendary group of people encountered by the Northern Paiute tribe, or the Northern Paiute people, who existed in Nevada, northwest Nevada to be exact. I'm always intrigued when we look at these images, though, that are ostensibly taken from the 1800s, at least again that's what we're informed of. What do they really communicate to us, though, about these people that existed during that time? There seem to be many unique traditions that are associated, and yet how much of this actually reaches us to this day? There always seems to be some odd figure that's in the background that is watching over many of these images. And what's really going on with a lot of this background? How developed is this civilization that they actually took this picture in? It paints many different conflicting images and accounts that we have, and one of the reasons that the Seti Ka are intriguing. Yes, this is the Seti Ka. I've always wanted to say that. Giants. Red-headed giants, anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall. But there's conflicting accounts, and of course historians and scholars have looked at these oral traditions of the northern Paiute people and have screened them, saying that, well, perhaps they merely encountered some people who were only taller, perhaps 6'9" or 6'10", but certainly not 8 to 10 feet tall. And yet there are numerous other accounts from Native American oral traditions that indicate the encounter with giants. Now, to be honest, in my travels I've never come across the bones of giants anywhere, and yet I've also never come across the bones of dinosaurs, so does that mean they don't exist either? I don't know. I leave it up for you to decide. But it's a very compelling account imagining what these people may have been faced with, and if they did indeed encounter actual giants, 8 to 10 feet tall or perhaps much larger, what was exactly the nature of this encounter? And who were these giants? Who were these Seti Ka that they encountered? And what methods or techniques did they come from with their particular civilization? How great of a threat were they to the northern Paiute people? What sort of theories could we come up with to try to explain the presence of these incredible giants? Were they simply natural denizens of the land at that time in what we think of as Northwest Nevada? Northwest Nevada is very interesting in and of itself, as it has many unique anomalies with it, along with these accounts that we have from the northern Paiute people. And indeed, we even have such accounts as places such as Pyramid Lake, named by the great explorer Charles Fremont, and Pyramid Lake named because it has pyramids in it. Is there truth behind these accounts of these giants that were encountered, and the threats that they may have posed to the northern Paiute people? And indeed other giants encountered in the central highlands of Mexico, and by other Native American groups, capturing and putting to death a giant. And why would they possess such a great threat? Well, could they have been some sort of remnant warrior that was brought about in the previous civilization? Or were they some sort of specialized hunter that was created through what we might think of as alchemical processes to hunt and terrorize the survivors of the last reset? And indeed, that seems to give us the impression of what's truly going on with many of the Native American oral traditions, that they had a better connection with the land and the other creatures that inhabited the land. And indeed, that's something that we see that rings true with all the Native American peoples and tribes that still exist to this day. Although we have conflicting accounts because mainstream studies, scholars, they try to go back and say that none of these accounts could be completely accurate. Perhaps it's simply exaggeration. It is oral tradition after all, and oral tradition is very easy to discredit because oral tradition does admit that there are multiple accounts, because it's transmitted by somebody talking to another person, and perhaps there could be something added to the message or subtracted from the message over time. Yet we look at the Lovelock Cave where this incident occurred in Nevada, or Nevada, or Nevada if you're in Iowa, many different ways to pronounce the same word, which is always rather enjoyable. But you consider this very climactic account in this final decisive confrontation between the northern Paiute and the Seti Ka, or the Seti Ke. And we look at other images, which of course we're told were debunked, and indeed many scholars have looked at this cave and this encounter, and they have certainly put their efforts into debunking the very existence of these giants. Of course, we don't know exactly when this encounter occurred, given our current chronological calendar, but we do have some idea that there are fossils and remains in these caves, but of course seeing them and actually analyzing them doesn't really give us any more answers. Is it possible that the northern Paiute encountered these giants? It's very possible. Now, could it also be possible that they simply encountered a wandering band of strange people who had red hair and were on the higher range of 6 feet tall? That's possible as well. But I believe that there's a little bit more of accuracy and validity to this particular account, because when you have oral tradition, it's climactic events, memorable events that tend to be remembered and transmitted on the oral tradition. And even with the variances in the different accounts that you have with the encounter of the Seti Ka, there's other tribes and other peoples across North America, and other lands as well, who've encountered giants. And yet it's always dismissed, it's always derided. Considering sacred sites across the land as well by various peoples and tribes and nations, it's also intriguing to me that we oftentimes look past Salton Lake, which is in Southern California.
Salton Lake has many different accounts associated with it. Some even say that it could be a gateway, a portal to other lands, and others say that the Native Americans had many different accounts with it, stating that it could have been a path to darkness. Also, the origin accounts of these lands in Southern California are very intriguing, and whether we're talking about the Colorado Desert, the Mojave Desert, or the Sonoran Desert, or any of the other deserts in Southwest United States, there's always something interesting associated with them. This Salton Sea, or Salton Lake, or all the other names that it's had, always seems to have had an interesting history of development with it. Indeed, in the 20th century, or the 1900s, the United States and the state of California attempted to develop this area, and it did not succeed for a variety of reasons that you can look up on your own, because it seems as though, once again, there's even conflicting accounts as soon as just a few decades ago. For whatever reason, the area is now mostly uninhabited, and there's all kinds of accounts of strange encounters. We also look at some of the brilliant landmarks in the southwestern desert, and whether we're driving through Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, or any of the other areas within the four-state, four-corner area where the ancestral Puebloans inhabited. Although how real are the ancestral Puebloans? Did they really exist as the mainstream tells us they did? Are they connected with the actual oral traditions of the Native American nations and tribes that inhabited the area? It's subject to much debate, and you'll even come across great craters, such as the Great Crater. But what really caused it? Is it really from some meteorite or asteroid impact, as we might be expected to believe? And even the mountains, the Tetons, as you go into Wyoming. Going all across the land, you have these very interesting landmarks that seem to give the clue that there's something much more dramatic that was going on in this western area of the United States. And many people and defenders of the mainstream narrative will simply try to tell us that the Native Americans are proof that there was no civilization that existed prior to our civilization. And yet the same mainstream will tell us that, well, actually the Native Americans did have great civilizations of their own, and some of them even built pyramids. It just depends on what latitude you're at, whether you call them pyramids or whether you call them mounds. Such as the interesting account behind Mount Rushmore, which we explored. Are we talking about kings? Are we talking about Vikings? Are we talking about six grandfathers? We've explored it in detail before, but one thing I always found intriguing about the Black Hills area of South Dakota where Mount Rushmore is situated is the fact that all Native Americans in that area consider it a very holy and respected place. And as they said in the film Dances of Wolves, even our enemies agree that this is a special place. And if you examine the terrain anywhere around the Black Hills, or what is today called Custer National Park, you'll see that. There are scenes of immense serene beauty that one could lose oneself in. And it's very easy to understand exactly how and why the people that we affiliate with the Native Americans, whether it's the Sioux or any one of the numerous tribes, do have a closer connection. And let's look at the account of the Hopi of the Fifth World. The Hopi, one of the descended tribes or nations from the ancestral Puebloans. What I find intriguing, though, about the accounts of the Hopi is some of the Puebloans, or the Pueblo ruins that are still present in the southwest United States. And whether we're in southwest Colorado or anywhere else, you'll see that there's some very dramatic ruins there that give you the impression of settlements that were very well constructed and planned out. And oftentimes you'll have the remnants of infrastructure that we tend to associate with older civilizations. Could this have been some sort of reset compound of its own? A place where the people attempted to survive? The Hopi are perhaps most interesting in terms of their account of the reset because they do have an oral tradition that relates that we are currently in what they consider the Fourth World, or at least the Fourth Era to them. And yes, this is one of the accounts that actually inspired the concept of the Five Eras on this channel. And I think there's a lot of details that do reach us through the Hopi oral traditions. And it should be noted that one of the reasons why I personally hold such a high respect for Native American nations and tribes is because of the fact that they have retained this very close connection that they have. One, to their own personal history, the true account of what happened, but also their understanding of achieving a balance with the land, the resources provided by the land, the other creatures that dwelled upon the land. That's something that I think is always respectable. When you actually look into the artwork of the Hopi, though, you'll find some very interesting representations. Now, were these just a people who didn't have an understanding of their land? The oral traditions and what we see, it seems that they had a great understanding of what was really happening, and the fact that they do relate to us of what happened in the distant past, with worlds that fell out of balance, with peoples who indulged in evil practices. And this is what ultimately caused what they would consider a reset in what they term the previous worlds. Now, once again, I'm just giving a generalized summary of these oral traditions. I think the best way to really share these oral traditions would be to actually have a member of one of these nations or tribes relay them on a video. And if there's a demand for that, I may consider it. As it may be, I do have the means of actually having some individuals relay their oral traditions. Now, are there oral traditions that they will not share? Absolutely. And can we really be surprised that there are many things that they don't share with others? Not at all. Because in many of the mentalities, it's because of the fact that knowledge has to be earned. You simply can't bestow it on people. You simply can't share something and have it repeated. And we certainly see examples of that in our current society, in our current civilization. That we simply repeat an account that's given to us, we apply no critical thinking or thought to it, and suddenly it becomes the truth, and it becomes the incontrovertible truth. And yet when you look across the land and you consider these many different wondrous accounts that the Native American nations had, their oral traditions seem to reflect many dimensions that were once really present on the land. And indeed, I've always given a lot more veracity to what they've shared with the origin story, especially with how the land came to be. One area that's always intrigued me is the Mojave Desert, and especially the area around what we call Death Valley to this day. How exactly was the land scarred in the way that it was? What's the true account of what really happened? Was there some sort of comet or meteorite that actually hit the area and destroyed the land? And what about the ant people? Yes, the ant people who helped the Hopi. It's even stated that they saved them twice from destruction, taking them to the underground, in great underground cities. And once again, we have another account of a more advanced people with greater cities. And who were these ant people? There's many different theories. Some state that they were extraterrestrials. Others state that they are simply more advanced civilizations that live in the crust of the very earth itself, or whatever you want to think of it as. There's many conflicting views in who and what the ant people could have been. But the fact that there's this spiritual resonance that you see that still endures with these oral traditions today, and the simple fact that they're still remembered and recounted. We can see how the Hopi were dispersed across the current state of Arizona, and where their reservations were. The reservations, a definite sign that the Native Americans endured a reset that was imposed by another power. That was just simply the way that they endured it. And then, of course, the American education system, which is all part of the conflict assimilation indoctrination concept or process that seemed to be used on everyone across the land after the last reset. And yet, for whatever reason, the Native Americans, whether it's the Hopi, the Navajo, the Lakota, or any of the other tribes or nations, managed to retain their connections with their past. And they've also managed to retain a very deep connection with the land. And that's one of the main reasons why I believe that they have a more accurate account of what may have transpired in the past. Now, are there other details that we still may be searching out? Are there other dramatic examples of what could have happened? Absolutely. But again, you simply can't repeat something. You simply can't share something. Knowledge has to be struggled for in many ways, shapes, and forms. And it takes experience. For example, looking at this incredible area. The Anasazi Ruin in Mesa Verde, southwestern Colorado. A very impressive city that seems to have been built in the very rock itself. Many intriguing realities exist, though, about these particular sites in terms of how they're actually hidden within the land, and they even seem to be hidden from aerial observation. Quite an interesting consideration if we're to take the past chronology that we're given from the mainstream at face value. Many of these wondrous terrain features, though, that these cities were hidden in still exist to this day, and we have to reevaluate exactly what we see in terms of the Native Americans. These weren't just a hunter-gatherer culture that simply roved the land as nomads. These were people that were very much in touch with their society, their culture, and their land. And the fact that they built incredible cities like this within the land itself. And we have to also evaluate what it means that they seem to have been concealed from aerial observation, because that's one of the realities that's often faced. It's an observation that's called out with many of these older settlements that still endure to this day. How exactly did they build them, and what resources did they really have? And when we look at the ruins of these cities and amazed at how well they're holding out, we also consider how we might think of this area as being very underpopulated currently. But was that always the case? And indeed, what actual details occurred within this particular land, these four corners of these states: Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and then even going beyond the four states to the west to Nevada. It's very intriguing when we consider these accounts and this impressive land. We consider the fact that these wondrous cities were once built by these people, seemingly hidden by aerial observation. Was there some sort of threat that could have come from the air? It's one of the things that when you look at how a city could have defended itself, we oftentimes look at the cities in Europe, and we've talked about the Great Star Fort fortifications. At least that's what we're informed about them, and indeed they even came across the United States during the United States Civil War. But these fortifications were not very effective. We consider the Cliff Palace and how it was actually constructed in Mesa Verde, and yet we see signs of similar construction. We see an industrious people who were creative and managed to actually build a very geometrically impressive city, and yet also conceal it within the very land itself. And whatever the adversary or threat that they were facing at that time, it was quite ingenious. And if you have the means and you're anywhere near Mesa Verde, Colorado, I certainly recommend visiting these sites, because there's nothing like an on-site exploration. The very impressive and geometrically precise Pueblo Bonito, laid out in northern Mexico, or northern New Mexico, by the ancestral Puebloans, as they are called. Again, what's the true history behind these peoples, and how exactly do they relate to the current nations and tribes? Do their oral traditions actually indicate that these great civilizations existed, or do they have a different account of them? That's something I certainly encourage you all to research and come to your own conclusions on, because it's very difficult to determine. And also remember the fact that if you go to further latitudes in the south, you'll come across actual pyramids. Mexico is really not that far away from New Mexico, and it's really not that far away from the United States, where we'll be assured that there were no pyramids built by the civilizations at that time. But whether we're talking about the Aztec, the Mayan, or the Incan, we always have signs that there may have been much more that was occurring in the past. When we look at northern New Mexico, we see one of the most dramatic remains of an area called Shiprock. Shiprock, with a very unique rock formation that, oddly enough, seems to have walls coming off from it, going in multiple directions. Of course, the mainstream tells us that this is merely the result of volcanic activity and a series of natural geological activity over the years, and yet the Navajo have quite the interesting origin story. And now let's go to St. Louis to look at the Mississippian culture. Yes, there were actual mounds in the city of St. Louis, although some people have tried to tell me that there were only mounds in Cahokia across the river in Illinois. But these mounds did actually exist in the city of St. Louis, and the mainstream and the official history of the city indicates that these mounds were removed. And these actual mounds that you could say resemble certain structures, we've been over it many times, were removed because they needed to make way for building the city of St. Louis. So once again, we have another account of a massive excavation project that had to be undertaken during a time when there was limited to virtually no heavy machinery, and yet once again working very, very hard and diligently and having plenty of time to pose for pictures. The people of St. Louis in the 1800s had the time to remove these mounds. Indeed, there was supposedly an ironclad, and yes, I'm going to use that term directly, in the United States Civil War, named the USS Mound City after this area of mounds. Unfortunately, somebody had the foresight to take pictures of these mounds before they were removed from St. Louis. Even an account saying that the mounds were removed to facilitate having the World's Fair. And now we're actually looking at the mound in Cahokia in Illinois, just to make it very clear for some people who try to claim that there were mounds that were only in Cahokia. Yes, this is the Great Mound in Cahokia. What was this really, though? Is this the remnant of something much more dramatic and a sign of something beyond natural terrain? Well, even the mainstream tells us that this is not just a hill, this is actually a mound, and that this was artificially constructed. But what's the truth of the reality behind this particular picture? What, in fact, is the truth behind these Mississippian cultures, as they called them? Now, these were ancient Native Americans, as they like to say, that lived in this particular area of the United States, centered around the Mississippi, although they seemed to spread out quite a bit, didn't they? And you might recall in the distant past of the channel, we did explore a site called Aztalan in Wisconsin. We'll take a look at that again because that is connected with these Mississippian cultures. And something else I'll ask you to consider is, do the oral traditions of the current Native Americans actually reflect the reality of these Mississippian cultures, or is this merely a mainstream interpretation from the current universities and scholars of the United States? And yes, I'm well aware that there are many Native Americans who have taken part in these studies, and I'm not saying or questioning their legitimacy. I'm merely saying that we need to apply critical thinking and ensure that what we're looking at is the actual account. Because what's intriguing to me about this Mississippian culture is just how advanced it's shown as being in a lot of this artwork. But how accurate is it? In other words, could it have been much more advanced? Could they have actually been the very cities that are still sitting there? Or is there some other explanation? Could it also be that what they're really referring to are the remnants of the civilization from the Third Era, before the reset to the Fourth Era? Or could it have simply been the surviving enclaves from the Fourth Era to our current era? Again, we're referring to the channel's 5 eras theory. But you can see how it ties wonderfully into the other accounts, oral traditions, that came from any number of Native American nations or tribes. Indeed, we look at how the Spanish explored the United States, according to the mainstream account, and what they may have come across. And oftentimes what we're told is that the early explorers gave us the details of these Mississippian cultured peoples, or whatever you want to call them, because they seem to have different names. Oddly enough, whatever group of people we're talking about, they left wondrous artwork and many different examples. We're also informed by those original European explorers, again, according to the mainstream, that these cultures were actually into human sacrifice, much like the Aztecs. And the reason were stated is that because they believed they were living in the final era, and the only thing that was going to keep the last sun from dying out was by engaging in human sacrifice. Although, how much truth is there to this account? And remember who this account came from, because we might want to recall that according to the mainstream history, the Spanish did impose this little economic system called encomienda, which was not exactly kind to the survival of many of the individuals from the civilizations that once flourished in these lands. Now, is this exactly what happened? Well, it's what the mainstream tells us. Or are there more details behind it? Is there something else occurring that we may not be aware of? Is there a reason that there is such an effort made to convince us that this Mississippian culture existed the way that it did? Is it simply trying to direct our focus somewhere else? There's no doubt that there's many mounds across the land, and no doubt that they seem to reflect a great understanding of engineering and geometric precision, and they certainly took a lot of work to achieve. And of course, we're not going to call them pyramids because they're not pyramids, they are mounds. But yet, whenever you look at the examples of the artwork and you understand exactly what it really reflects, you have to ask, is this something that this actual people did? Or were these merely remnants and artifacts that were found later that were attributed to a different group of people? How could anybody or everybody get it exactly right, is all I'm asking. Because it's amazing to me how confident we are and how oftentimes we like to hand wave, categorize, and label many groups of people. And we still do that to this day. And it certainly doesn't have to be an ancient people or civilization that we're not aware of. But yet we seem to have this perception that this great culture, this great civilization was capable of achieving these mounds, and they had a great understanding of the land. And yet they always want to tell us that they seem to have a darker side, while at the same time ignoring our own darker side. Going back to the Aztalan site in Wisconsin, near Lake Mills in Wisconsin, just south of I-94 between Madison and Milwaukee, I'm reminded of those sites that I saw there. And over a year ago, I walked them and actually explored them. And if you have any sort of site with mounds like this anywhere close to where you may be located in the land, I strongly suggest walking it and looking at it on site. The reason I started with Google Earth, and this was actually one of the original explorations that turned me away from using Google Earth, because there were a lot of details that you just don't see. But when you actually get on the ground, you'll see what a mound looks like and what a pyramid actually looks like. And remember that we define certain things as mounds, especially anything in the United States, and the only pyramids in North America are to be found in what is today Mexico. Is there something more to this account, or once again, is it just a hand-wave explanation? Are we being intentionally confused, or is the mainstream not fully understanding exactly what happened in the past? Is there something that's attempting to be hidden, or is it just simply confusion and misunderstanding? Not necessarily any sort of purposeful intention to mislead, but simply not being aware of what actually happened. I'm always amazed when you just consider that, when you compare any mound to any of the bona fide pyramids that we have down in Mexico. And oftentimes when we talk about pyramids, it tends to set off a lot of different things. For example, we sometimes seem to have issues when we want to talk about certain areas with pyramids. For example, in Sudan, nobody ever talks about the pyramids there, but there are many pyramids in Sudan. They're very beautiful. Going back to the Aztalan Mound, it's not a pyramid, it just looks like one. It just has steps and levels to it, and somebody put a lot of effort into building it. But it was looking at images like these and then looking at Google Earth that convinced me that I needed to get on the ground out there. I really needed to take a closer look because I realized that what we were actually seeing might not be reflected even in these images and on Google Earth. And I know I was making quite an issue at that point, and one of the reasons I share this is just to recollect and understand how we've come as explorers over this time, how our perceptions have changed, and really understanding what this is. What are these mounds in reality? Are they the remnants of structures from a distant civilization in the past? Or are they simply the remains of structures that the last civilization or the fourth era attempted to construct to survive the oncoming reset? The interesting thing when you look at the oral traditions of many of the Native Americans is that they seem to be well aware of events that were coming and were prepared for them accordingly. Now, is there something more behind that? Did they have some awareness through some means we didn't understand? Did their actual existence give them a prescient capability? Or did somebody come along and warn them? Well, it depends on which accounts you actually look at. Indeed, it seems as though these ant people who assisted the Hopi in their survival seem to have an awareness and understanding of what was happening. Why is it we see so many examples of observatories over time that are all across the land? Indeed, there were so many observatories that were informed or constructed during the 1800s. Was there something that they were really watching for in what we think of as the sky? And of course, we have our different divergences in terms of what the sky really is. But why was there such a focus on that? Could it possibly be related to the awareness that whoever these ant people really were had, that they were able to use to assist the Hopi? Did they assist others? And could there have been a darker side to this account? Was it really a benevolent, altruistic assistance that these ant people lended to the Hopi? Or did they have more malicious intentions in mind? The Hopi oral tradition seems to record that they were a benevolent people. But again, we always have to look at multiple different sides to everything and not discount anything. The Aztalan site interested me though in Wisconsin because looking at these old images, it did seem to convey that it was a step pyramid. And looking at some of the original sketches of the ground, it once again seemed to match many of the other things that we had seen over time. And now, doing well over a year of explorations, we can see that the map of the Aztalan ground shows many great structures and a very impressive layout. But why is it that we always have this mentality that this had to be a certain way? And how could anybody who lived hundreds of years after this all transpired know exactly what things were like in these particular societies, these towns, these mounds? What was really the intention behind them? In fact, when you actually go and you walk the grounds and you look at some of the historical markers there, they'll inform you that it was the early European stories or the early European explorers who regaled their stories behind what these people were like. Actually, being on site, I remember being impressed at how everything was laid out. But I also noticed that there seemed to be an intention to communicate to us about what was really going on, as though we were supposed to have a particular perception. Because you might notice they put the palisades everywhere, and did those actually exist? Why would anybody bother with those? That almost looks like something that gives you a little bit of a distant past, or maybe some perception that's not actually correct with what the people at that time used. And again, what are we really walking on here? These are the kind of things that we need to consider, because when you look dead ahead at the mound, you can see that there's a lot of geometric precision to it. You can't simply try to hand wave it away and say it's a natural formation, although at this point in time I wouldn't be surprised if someone tried to do that. When you're actually on the grounds, you'll come across these little historical markers that'll tell you the appearance and manner of dress, and they do say it was from European explorers' descriptions. And then they even give you an idea of the social organization. And once again, I'm just asking this question. Are these accounts actually from the Native American oral traditions, or are they from subsequent scholarly and university-funded studies? It's just a question. I was always amazed, though, that when you look back at this particular mound, you definitely get that impression of many of those step pyramids that we see at the further southern latitudes in North America. And why is that? Is it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or do you see a completely different structure when you look in this particular direction? Do you get an idea that you really could be standing on something that was once immense and amazing? That even with the passage of time and even with the growth over it of the grass and the trees and everything else, you can get the idea that there is something beneath our feet that is very dramatic, and something that we have many clues, many different accounts from the Native Americans' oral traditions that might tell us what was really happening. That might give us a better idea in terms of our true account of what actually happened. Now, as I always say, the mainstream could be correct, but with every exploration that I do, I find it less and less likely. But again, that's just me. I, of course, leave it to you to come to your own conclusions. Maybe you think that our chronology transpired to our current calendar exactly as we're informed. Maybe there's no signs of intervention here on this site. Perhaps this is what it was really like. But walking along the site and really seeing it and really connecting with it personally, I still think to this day that it doesn't match what we're told. Although there was one use that I had for Google Earth, and that was actually off the official site. There was a much greater mound between it and the town of Lake Mills in Wisconsin. And I really have to ask what exactly was going on at that greater mound. Is that really a piece of terrain that really looks like a mound from the ground? I decided to drive past it and look at it and notice that it did give an impression of a very large mound. Or could it have been some other structure? Well, we'll just classify it as just another monadnock. But what are your thoughts on all this? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Great deserts of the land, found everywhere at different latitudes. A unique environment. But is it possible there was a unique life form in this unique environment at one point in time? When we explore it, we see unique structures, and perhaps they're just simply natural structures that have artificially looking features to them. Yet if you go around the desert enough, you can be excused for understanding that there may have been a very different form of life there. Our official mainstream and scientific accounts tell us that evolution is the explanation for different life. But what if there's an entirely different account, a oral tradition that relates a different sort of cycle that we've looked at? In this exploration, we're going to examine the account of the Hopi, their 5 ages, and most specifically, the very unique account of the saviors of their particular culture, their society, the ant people. We have found many examples that indicate that there was some sort of hive civilization that may have existed. Now, whether this civilization was subterranean or existed on the surface, and the details that we still find in the Hopi culture that may refer to it, the very dramatic landscapes of the desert that give rise to the possibility of different civilizations and a very different form of life, a completely different account of our origins and what we may have endured in the past. Come join me as we explore the account of the legend of the ant people. The Hopi, a Native American tribe, at least according to our official definitions. I'm always interested by the fact that we have this tendency of broadly categorizing peoples in this day and age. For example, we refer to Native Americans or indigenous people as the original inhabitants of all of North America, and depending what nation you're in, you'll have different broad categorizations. And yet each of these peoples represent unique tribes, unique nations with different societies and unique customs. The Hopi are one of many. And yet one of their main accounts of having 5 ages or 5 eras has no doubt inspired the theory of 5 eras on this channel. I wanted to look at the Hopi tradition and their oral traditions of the concept of the ant people. This legacy of, in the past, their entire civilization being destroyed, one time by fire and another time by ice. And the ant people were a group of people who helped the Hopi survive both of these horrific calamities, at least according to the oral tradition. Now, I am not going to try to relay the exact details of the Hopi oral tradition, because I did not grow up in that society. But we are going to look at it objectively and try to find a way in which it fits into the concept of our 5 eras, and even look at some different theories for what the ant people really were. The Hopi are very intriguing in the fact that within their cultural traditions, they do show different varieties that indicate something that is, well, just unbelievably amazing in terms of its variety and creativity, if we are to believe that these are simple cultural traditions that were not inspired. And yet we have the feeling when we look at the images and we study these cultural traditions of the Hopi that they do seem to be quite, frankly, divinely inspired. That there really was a situation in which these people faced imminent destruction. And we look at the other remnants across the land, and the Hopi existed, officially, for thousands of years in northern Arizona. Now it's possible that their people have been there for far longer. What I've always found intriguing about our official mainstream explanation for the people that came to North America crossing the land bridge in the Bering Strait is that they all did develop their unique languages and unique customs. Now I suppose on a long enough timeline, perhaps we could accept that explanation, but I always had an interesting difficulty with it, because oddly enough, it's the exact same story that we have over in Europe. We're to believe that Europeans are one large culture, one large group, and yet when we look between the lines, we find many differences. You can find no shortage of references and artwork that depict these ant people. Who were they and what were they? The official tradition of the Hopi simply says that they were a special race that resided in subterranean areas and that they provided aid to the Hopi to allow them to survive these calamities. Or perhaps as we compare it to our reset theories on the channel and looking at the previous 5 eras, that the ant people were benefactors of the Hopi. Were they divine benefactors, or were they a special and unique race of beings that happened to be existing in either different parts of the land or perhaps even different areas of land that are difficult to access? And that for whatever reason they provided aid to the Hopi to allow them to survive these terrifying calamities. The details that we find within these legends are very compelling and very intriguing. There's also the fact that there is the ongoing presence of the ant people that is practiced and still remembered to this day, from both the Hopi and then their oral traditions going beyond their own society. The really interesting thing is that when you look at the Southwest Desert in the United States, you do get that impression that the land has been subjected to terrifying forces in the past. Now, once again, mainstream science has explanations for why we have different environments, different climate zones in different areas of land, and that there's unique weather factors that may have contributed to this. And these may all be true, and yet when you see some of the dramatic and unique existences that still linger in the desert to this day, the Southwest Desert in the United States is very intriguing. The fact that it is such an arid and yet almost lifeless environment from some perspectives, and yet life very much did flourish. There's even the signs that there are other sorts of life that still continue to flourish and may have once prospered in the desert in the past. We always think of that example of the burro or the donkey, the creature that was brought in by miners during the 1800s and was simply left to die, and yet left to its own devices, the donkey or the burro flourished. So is it a similar tale then with the Hopi or other peoples that may have just simply been left on the land? Or trying to figure out exactly what the origin and the true identity of these ant people really are? Was there some grander plan? Why is it that we have all these different legacies and legends that still endure to this day? It's not just with the Hopi, though. Many different cultures and many societies have these traditions, these myths, these legends about how they came to be. And yet it's interesting to think that there are a lot of overlapping themes within them. There's the concept of some being, whether it's divine or otherwise, having a greater capability, and utilizing that greater capability to help the people that still exist to this day that needed to survive these calamities in the past. And I would argue that this is some of the evidence that we have that these calamities did indeed occur. It was not a one-time event, but there's evidence that these terrifying reset events occurred on multiple occasions. And the legacy of the Hopi and their oral tradition of fire and ice. At one point in time, the land was beset with fire, and another point in time, it was beset with ice. They even tell us that the reason that ants are so thin is because the ants actually provided their own sustenance to sustain the people. Now, that's a very benevolent perception of these ant people. But what were they really? And why is it that we have the Hopi who show this divine adherence to remembering what the ant people really provided them? I've always been amazed by the Kachina dolls itself. The Kachina dolls themselves that seem to represent something that goes beyond a divine or even a more advanced being. It's almost as though it seems to be an amalgamation of a spiritual and yet a more advanced technological sophistication that was once possessed by these beings that of course we would think of as gods or other divine beings. But what were they really? And there's always that hard question of, were these saviors or were these tormentors? Because if this was some sort of separate species or separate race, referring to the ant people, what was their true intention? Did they only want to help the Hopi? Or were there other groups of human beings that had to go through these reset periods? Were they simply left to their own devices and ultimately left to die? Or were they abandoned, much in the same way that the donkey was officially abandoned in the Southwest American desert during the mining activities? What do these Kachina dolls really represent, though, on a deeper level? Is it just simply a spiritual reference, or are they really showing the technological capacity that these beings really had? There's other strange rumors that endure to this day of what's really happening in the Southwest Desert. Now, it may simply be the fact that this is a very extreme environment. You have very low moisture in the desert, and certain areas of the high desert, such as the Mojave, which is adjacent to northern Arizona, you see rather unique environmental effects that occur. Was the land always this way, or is it simply the lingering effects of terrific forces that the lands were subjected to in the past? And that's why we have these legacies and these legends that endure to this day. I'm also fascinated by the fact that, once again, we have people that did not witness these events and did not participate in them, claiming that they know better in terms of what happened, as opposed to the people who actually have an oral tradition. There's a very intriguing connection, and it goes beyond a surface connection when you compare the origin accounts of both the Hopi and the Sumerians and the subsequent Babylonians. The concept of how the sky god actually compares from Babylonian and Sumerian myth to the concept of the ant people. is it possible that these are actually referring to the same beings? Were they really deities, or were they actually some sort of advanced culture? And perhaps an even more disturbing consideration, that these cultures could have been species that actually survived previous resets, and they had greater knowledge. We even see areas in the terrain, such as Cappadocia, Turkey, which we've explored in detail, where it appears as though a civilization or structures have been built on top of the remnants of previous structures. Now, once again, our mainstream science assures us that this is all natural terrain that just happens to have the appearance of artificial structures that have structures built on top of it. And because of the unique conditions provided by the climate, that these natural structures were malleable and could easily be formed into modern houses, dwellings, and cathedrals, and even, of course, our favorite castles. That's the official explanation we get for Cappadocia. But could you look at it from another perspective? Do you see something different when you look at this? Does this resemble some sort of hive-like environment? A physical hive-like environment? Perhaps some sort of subterranean civilization that had lived and existed underground, that eventually made its way back to the surface over a long enough period of time. Why were they down there for so long? Did they have to survive the terrible calamity of fire from the sky, or an ice environment? Even the various cultural representations of the Hopi seem to refer to this pattern, and you'll see this representation of these ant people appearing in many different places. It's almost more prevalent than you tend to see certain icons in other religions, and that's something else I've found rather fascinating. And it would be very interesting to listen to the full oral traditions that we have. And of course there are nuances, there are varieties of these oral traditions. One thing I consider, though, is it possible that these ant people were not just the benign benefactors that we have an account of? Could it also be possible that they were operating with a completely different form of intent? Were human beings, or the human beings that we know to this day, the natural human beings, or have they been altered over time? Or could they be referencing the offshoots of these original species? It's hard to say. Looking at some of the diagrams that we have, though, of extensive underground caverns and maps and existences that we know to be real, then we have to ask these hard questions, that if there was a subterranean civilization, and indeed there are many indications that there was, and there's still evidence that there were subterranean civilizations, then how were these subterranean constructions achieved? Once again, we'll be informed that it's because we had a lot of will and just time on our hands in the distant past, and we were willing to take the painstaking effort to carve out these vast caverns, these incredible labyrinths that are subterranean. But does that really make sense? Would one actually go to all this effort, even if the soil or the material that they were carving through was more prone to being carved through? It still takes a lot of effort. And effort during a time when we're informed that there were logistical limitations. Of course, logistical limitations are never taken into account, it seems, when we're considering some of these mainstream accounts that we have of the past. But I look at some of these representations of these divine beings, and the other question that comes into my mind is, if they're not necessarily representing divine beings, then what are they representing? Could these ant people and these other references and terms that we have for these divine beings, and it seems as though every society and culture, whether it's an ancient civilization or even the more modern civilizations, have different references to these divine beings. They seem to represent perhaps an heightened technological capability. Perhaps they did have greater technology that may have seemed divine to those that existed at the time and actually kept the record of what really happened. What truly transpired during the time of these great calamities or these catastrophes, these accounts that we have of floods or fire from the sky, or even the land being covered in ice? And that's where I've always found a lot of interest, because if you step far enough back, you do actually find a lot more overlap within both the mainstream perspective of what happened in the past and even the alternative research perspective of what happened in the past. You can actually find connections between references of glaciers going over the land and, of course, this concept of the land being frozen at particular points in time. But you have to ask, is that where we lost the detail? Or do we still have the detail? It's just been mixed and confused in a series of overlapping accounts, and therefore we can never get the idea of what truly transpired. I look at the representations that we have of Sumeria and Babylon, and it strikes me with all the similarities that we have, especially with societies and civilizations that existed in completely different parts of the land and were isolated from one another, at least officially. Yet these stories that we look at in these details, when we examine them in totality, seem to give us much more connection than we'd ever expect to find. When you see the numerous cave drawings or the incredible artwork and then even the costumes and the divine reference that the Hopi have for the ant people, you get the impression that perhaps there was something more to the existence of these beings, that there is this sort of detail that's captured and remembered to this day, and not just in the oral traditions, but also in the cultural traditions. And really think about this when we have people that are dressing up or showing reverence for other beings or other creatures. Think about the fact that while it may seem far-fetched in some extraordinary account, or of course we always want to refer to the alien concept that we have, and it's not to discredit that, but it's merely to look at things from an objective point of view. Possible that there were, and maybe still are somewhere, beings that look like this. And would this explain a lot of these strange encounters that we've had over time? Whether these are actual strange encounters that are referenced in official history, or are they simply anecdotes that have been taken too far with certain details ascribed to them? You can go to this day and still explore all these vast subterranean compounds, whether you go to Turkey and many other areas across the land, where you can find extensive cave systems that you wouldn't expect to find them. I'll reference one example in the United States, Kentucky, where they have incredibly large cave systems that many happen to be overlooked, of course, aside from the main tourist areas that we have, which seem to be the areas that we're supposed to pay attention to. But when we're paying attention to those areas, we often forget how all-encompassing, how omnipresent these subterranean systems really are. And it does lend credence to the original theory or the oral tradition that there was the existence of a civilization that was underground. Now the question endures, was this just simply our predecessors? Or were our predecessors simply allowed to survive in these areas? Or, from a more negative perspective, were they taken down there to be altered, to be changed, and perhaps even to be experimented on in ways that defy our imagination? Because while you have more advanced technology, and we discussed in our explorations this past week, technology is a two-edged sword. It can be used for good purposes, it can be used for evil purposes, and it can be used for everything in between. The ambiguity of having these incredible cave and subterranean systems that exist to this day being an example. Now, perhaps you're more comfortable believing that it was merely a group of our predecessors who simply had a lot of time on their hands or were seeking to survive whatever terrifying empire was hunting them down, and rather than flee to more easy areas to hide in, they decided to carve themselves caves in areas because they had no other options. And that may be possible, but there are so many details behind that account that I always found unlikely. I'm also interested in the fact that these 5 ages that the Hopi really seem to understand and be aware of do show an equivalence that we find in other societies and other traditions. These cultures showing these divine beings or other forms of life. And that's the next question that we have to ask. Are these ant people, are these Anunnaki, are these Tuatha Danann, and all the different names that we have for these divine beings, are they really in fact divine beings? Or are they other forms of life? Is it even possible that they're species that existed in earlier eras that did manage to find a way to survive the reset? Now, that begs the question, well, if there were other beings that survived the reset, other great civilizations, then where are they today? There may be an explanation in the fact that there are physical realms or physical capacities of existence that are beyond our ability to access. To this day, we still have a very large debate about what the exact shape of the land is, and once again, while we're assured that we know exactly what the shape of the land is, and we have a lot of evidence that is incontrovertible according to many, the fact remains is that it is still debated. There's also accounts that the shape of the land did change. Now, the shape of the land changing, is that a mainstream account? Yes, indeed it is, because we do have the theory, or if you want to consider it a fact depending on your perspective, the existence of all the continents being together as Pangea. And when you look at the unique details that we have captured of the Hopi engaging in their cultural traditions, we do see something rather extraordinary. Almost a completely different way of life that has somehow been preserved over time. Now, is this something that the Hopi had as their original traditions, or was this something that they learned from their divine benefactors? Were they chosen by the ant people to survive? Or was it just all simply part of a larger experiment? The ant people were not the divine benefactors. They were actually more of a malign, intented being that wanted to see what would happen if they aided certain groups of people and did not aid certain groups of people. We don't know for sure, and that's why we have to consider all accounts. And is it even possible that this idea of creatures or a species resembling ants might be far-fetched and may simply be an interpretation? That's also entirely possible as well. Is it possible that the ant people that are remembered by the Hopi were simply other human beings that were wearing some sort of form of an apparatus, or dare I say, an environmental suit, a space suit, and that's really what the Hopi remembered and that's what they captured in their tradition? That's possible as well. And you can find numerous examples of this if you go back and you watch an old TV series called Space 1999, and I'll reference an episode called The Mission of the Darians. You'll see that the Darians actually managed to cause people to believe that they were some sort of divine being simply by wearing an environmental suit. Because if you had people that had never seen these things before, then what would they make of them? And whether we're considering the Hopi traditions or the traditions and the myths that we have from Sumeria or Babylon or countless others, we do have to ask that question. Are they really representing divine beings? Or are they simply representing humans that had more advanced technological capabilities? And maybe what we might think of as more advanced humans. Of course, there's another disturbing question that we have to consider. Is it possible that in addition to having advanced technological capabilities, that these humans were advanced in other ways that we don't like to consider? Ways that we're told not to consider today, such as introspection, the, how shall we say, strengthening of their own spirit, the connection that they had between their physical and spiritual form. Now, many will argue that science has disproven this, and yet there are many areas that science doesn't have an answer for. They have theories, but we always have to define the difference between a theory and a fact. And when you look at the remnants of these incredible subterranean compounds, and we think of the subterranean compounds that we have, that we know, or at least believe, that our own civilization has constructed, there does seem to be this recurring mentality, this idea that the only way to survive catastrophic events, whether it was past, present, or future, is by constructing these subterranean compounds. What is the real origin of this elaborate and dramatic terrain that we see in the southwestern United States? Very, very prominently in areas that seem to be very controlled. And maybe there's a good reason why these areas are controlled. Maybe it is simply to preserve their natural aesthetic appearance and to make sure that it endures for future generations. There's no doubt that's what will be informed, but could there be other explanations behind it? Is this just natural terrain that we're looking at, and it was formed by natural forces over time? Or is there perhaps another explanation? The very formation of the land. I'm always interested too when you look at some of the adobe huts and the different constructions, and you see a wide variety of capability with the Hopi alone. Now keep in mind, when we consider the Hopi, we're only examining one tribe, one nation. There are many tribes, many nations, with many different traditions. Yet for some unknown reason, we have this overlapping within their origin. And yet even in different civilizations that were located across oceans, which shouldn't have had any sort of contact. And yet we seem to have different explanations that try to account for this discrepancy that we have. Why is it that we say that the Egyptians have presence all across the land if they were indeed confined to geographical areas? Or the Babylonians, or the Sumerians? All these accounts we have of these sea people who just showed up and caused an apocalypse, but we really don't know a lot about them. Well, you could say that we don't really know a lot about what transpired 150 years ago because we don't have any first-hand sources to consult with. We have a very well-documented recorded history, and we're very confident in that. Because in the United States especially, our history from the 1800s was recorded by journalists. And if we trust journalists and the historians that interpreted what the journalists recorded after the fact, then we know we have a very confident view of our history. But going back in the distant past, do we have that same confidence? Or are we really left to the devices of hypothesis and speculation? And of course, that's why people set out to deride those that engage in hypothesis and speculation, even though mainstream science says that evolution is a theory, although some will present it as a fact, and those words exactly were used. Now, ultimately, I'll leave it to you to decide what to believe, because that is supposed to be a freedom that you're entitled to wherever you are in the land, whatever your particular nation or your government is to this day. You're at least supposed to be able to decide what you really believe. But what did the Hopi really believe? Did they really believe that there were these creatures, these divine beings from their perspective that resembled ants? These divine beings that sustained them through difficult catastrophes on multiple occasions? Catastrophes that completely changed the land. The accounts say that these Hopi were taken to subterranean compounds, and there they were enabled to survive the catastrophes that were afflicting the land. They were also provided with sustenance. And then there's other accounts that these ant people went so far as to sacrifice to ensure that the Hopi survived. We're not really sure exactly what happened. And it could be that the ant people aren't any sort of different creature, that they were merely other types of human beings, or other human beings that had more advanced technological capabilities, and that the devices, the technology that they used, was the only appearance that the Hopi or their progenitors actually witnessed. And as a result of that, it worked its way into their oral tradition and their legends, and really what they have are human beings that were wearing environmental suits at all points in time when they witnessed them. And as a result of that, they perceived them as a completely different creature. And you will find numerous examples of that, whether you look in science fiction, fiction, or other sources that show that the concept of people's identity and their culture and what they witness and what they capture is very malleable. Look no further than all of the unique societal developments that occurred after World War II, with the sudden presence of Allied soldiers in isolated islands across the Pacific. And look at the cultural effects there. Now step far enough back and consider how these things could be perceived over a long period of time, with oral traditions being passed down. How long were these oral traditions passed down for? Are we talking periods of thousands of years? Or are we talking an even greater timeline? Or even more disturbingly, are we talking a much more shortened timeline? Because I think one of the difficulties that we have is just how quickly things can change. Just think about this. If you completely remove an entire generation, just one single generation, one 20-year period, one entire group of people that passes down all the knowledge, all the understanding to the next generation, then in a 20-year time frame, would it be possible to induce an entirely new societal identity, an entirely new culture on a people? How long would it really take? Because I believe we have numerous examples that that time frame is on a much shorter period than we'd like to believe. Now, whatever the actual existence of time is it simply the passage of the seasons? Does it have a real physical identity to it? That's something we can definitely debate. And there's even the argument that there are multiple overlapping timelines, or that time itself doesn't even exist. It's simply a perspective that we have, and that we share to try to achieve some sort of shared understanding.
Now, other people say, well, we age, there's demonstrable signs of the passage of time, and while this may be true, there are other accounts that show that perhaps time's not as fixed as we like to think. Even going back to the legend of how Merlin aged in reverse, and he was able to foretell prophecy because he had already witnessed such events. Now, while these may seem like extreme accounts, these are all the details that we have to take into consideration when we're trying to understand the legacy of the ant people. The disturbing revelation of the fact that these may have been benign beings, but they also may have been tormentors. It's possible that we just don't know what their true intention was. Maybe they simply wanted to exist and survive by factoring in a civilization in the underground. There has to be some reason why that theme is still so strong with us to this day. Now again, you can look at the mainstream society that we have and the ongoing stated threat of nuclear annihilation. It certainly makes it a sensible prospect to have a developed survival complex underground. Yet you can find other more modern films and forms of fiction that'll tell you that no matter how far underground you go, there might not be any survival. I'll reference the more recent 2000s film Knowing, where no matter how far you went underground, it wasn't going to save you from that particular calamity. But interesting to consider, the subterranean compounds with their nuances and their details. Some are extensive subterranean compounds where you could fit tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people within. And yet others are smaller dwellings, almost giving the impression that there really was this desire, this effort to establish this. And I'm under the mindset that it went a lot further than simply trying to evade some Roman authorities that were chasing them on horseback at the time. There's even the more recent discoveries that were informed, and I haven't been to this site specifically, that we're given the impression that this is evidence of ancient human existence. And yet it fascinates me that we overlook one of the more basic observational details with this image, that we see what appears to be some sort of hive compound. And so, is this giving some credence to the theory that the ant people really did exist? That there was some sort of advanced life form that resembled an insect, or really was an advanced insect itself? Because one thing we don't know is, what are the possibilities of life? We think we understand it. We have the mainstream account that evolution takes a very long period of time. It's over millions of years that evolution occurs, to where a fish can go to a tube, to a monkey, to a human being. That's what will be informed from the mainstream. But yet we have a lot of other evidence that indicates that there can be sudden, abrupt changes. Is it possible that there was a technological capacity in the much nearer past than we'd like to think that had the ability to abruptly change the very form of life itself? What exactly is the dividing line between divine and technological capability? And does that line become a lot more blurred when we're trying to understand it over a period of time from accounts from the past? Why is it that there are so many overlapping mentalities with the traditions of whether it's the Hopi or any other group of societies or civilizations that seem to have a more advanced technological component that goes beyond simply divine being? And is it Arthur C. Clarke's statement that any sufficiently advanced civilization or technology would seem like magic to a less advanced civilization or technology? That seems to be the overlap that we have when we're trying to reconcile all these differences that we have. Now, of course, you can embrace the mainstream account and accept the belief that, yes, we've answered all the questions. Yes, there are no mysteries. And that even trying to look at things from the perspective of mystery is a colossal waste of time. But I don't think you'd be here if you really thought any of that was true and that this is a waste of time, because why is there such an effort to try to convince us that it's a waste of time? It's a waste of time, then simply let us waste our time, and what difference does it make to you? In fact, the efforts to try to convince us that we are wasting our time are interesting to me. Because ultimately, should we not have the freedom to decide how to expend our own time? Well, no, there are many people out there who
tell us and believe that they think they know what's best for us. And these people aren't part of institutions, they're not even part of governments or any other interests that we might traditionally associate with trying to control people. They're merely individuals who think they know what's best for whatever reason, and you'll find them in your midst all the time. But I strongly suggest that if you have the opportunity to really explore the nuances and the details of these different societies, these different cultures, look at them on their own, and then step far enough back and look at the commonalities that you see between them. And don't just allow things such as geographical separation or even quantum separation to make you believe that there are differences within these civilizations and these societies in the way that they viewed things. Because when you factor out distance and time, you suddenly find that there are a lot more similarities than we like to think. We suddenly realize that this may all be the same account, just simply told from different perspectives. That there really is one unified series of events that transpired in the past, and that it really is possible for us to gain a greater understanding of what truly happened. That it goes beyond the limitations of belief and the hard science that some other expert has to share with us. Now, that's not to discount that study. It's not to say that there aren't details in it. I mean, I myself even think that there is something behind the concept of the fourth dimensional structure of our entire spatial existence. But I don't believe that's the end-all be-all answer. I think that it's something even in greater grandeur than we could even begin to understand. It's certain to say that I don't think that we can perceive it with sight alone, that there might be a lot of other nuances behind it. But that's just my personal belief. You are certainly welcome to your personal beliefs, and by all means, share them. But why is it when we look at the terrain in different places, we do see something of a monument to the past? Now, whether we want to classify that monument as something that was created by natural forces or artificial forces, well, perhaps you could even say that that delineation is irrelevant in and of itself, because we do see the remains of the past everywhere that we look. And I think that's one of the closest things we can say to an incontrovertible fact that there is. And it's one of the reasons why I encourage you that if you have the ability and the access, that you explore structures that are nearby to your physical location. Explore your local government buildings that seem to defy the understood capability of the civilization that constructed them at the time. Explore mounds. Explore things that were informed were created by indigenous peoples of the distant past. Compare and contrast them. Don't limit your understanding by saying, well, that couldn't have been so because someone else told me it couldn't have been so. Really entertain the possibility for a moment. See the connections and see if you can really extrapolate from those connections an idea of how our true history is. I believe that is one of the most important legacies that we can have. And do these ant people still exist? Do the Anunnaki still exist? Do the Tuatha De Danann still exist? Or do their descendants still exist? I think of the example from the science fiction TV show Babylon 5 from the 1990s, where it posited the existence of different civilizations at different times. There were the old ones, the original species that came about first, and then the newer, younger races that followed them. And the main theme of Babylon 5 was how these old ones, or these original races, tried to influence the younger races. They tried to encourage and create a divine theocracy, in some cases, if you will. The Shadows or the Vorlons. And you can certainly do your own research and watch the TV series and see how these themes are presented. And it's a very unique presentation. Now, another interesting little fact is that the other science fiction series at the time, Star Trek, specifically Star Trek The Next Generation, had their own concept of a progenitor species, or an older race called the Preservers, if you will. And there was an episode called The Chase in Star Trek The Next Generation that posited this entire existence. Now, granted, Babylon 5 was more of an ensemble show that had overarching plot threads that went about through the entire season, whereas Star Trek was viewed as something that was standalone. But the idea and the theme is exactly the same, where you have these older races, these older beings, and we think of these older races or older beings as perhaps those that survived resets, and maybe even found a way to which they could exist far longer than the limited period of time that we have.
Now, whatever the duration of that time frame is, whether it's hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of years, it's hard to say because we really don't know what came in the past. Now, maybe you want to embrace the concept of having that confidence that you know exactly what the chronology of the past is, and I understand that there's a comfort in that. It's very difficult to see things as being ambiguous or ambivalent, to not have answers, because we are conditioned to seek answers and to know exactly what the solution to every problem is. We find it in our main forms of mental exercise every single day. And we live currently in a civilization that reinforces us, gives us positive reinforcement to find those answers. It's much more difficult to exist where there are mysteries, where there is ambiguity. When you see drawings like this and you admit to yourself, I don't exactly know what they represent. And yes, certainly you can listen to the Hopi oral traditions and you can realize and think that, yes, it was simply the elaborate imagination of people in the past who couldn't explain how they survived some terrifying event, and therefore they used their imaginations to explain it, and they recorded these drawings. And these cultural traditions endured over a period of time. And yes, that's completely possible. But it's also possible that these references to these incredible beings do have a lot more rooted in reality than we like to think. That this really is referring to a more advanced civilization. That whether these ant people, or whatever other name that we have for them in other cultures, whether they were benign or whether they had terrifying intent, that if they did exist, and if they do exist, then it is evidence, it is an indicator that it is possible to live on a much longer timeline. To not just have a singular lifestyle, but also to have a mentality where your existence, the existence of your civilization, will endure. To where you could achieve feats of, how shall we say, physical and spiritual transcendence. And if you do watch Babylon 5 to its conclusion, you'll see that that does seem to be the fate to any life form that exists on a long enough period of time. That it continues to grow. And maybe evolve isn't exactly the proper word. Perhaps something else happens. Maybe we achieve some sort of awareness that we're supposed to achieve. That instead of just achieving balance with our natural environment, we're actually able to achieve some sort of transcendence, some sort of transformation. And that's how we actually explain this concept that we have of our existence here. Perhaps that's the true purpose of life, that we're to face these trials and tribulations, and we're to gain this internal insight, this introspection. Because you'll find that virtually every mechanism that we have in our current civilization, right, wrong, or indifferent, it seems to function to keep us from engaging in this introspection, from looking within and trying to achieve this greater understanding. I think that's perhaps one of the greatest examples that we have of the possibility of the existence of the ant people. Now, were they saviors or were they tormentors? And if they do still exist, is it possible that they are influencing our current civilization? Because again, taking the example of the TV series Babylon 5, we found that these older races did have very, how shall we say, difficult means of influencing the younger races to do their bidding, to act in their own interest. And is that the reason why we have all these interesting cycles that we observe? Or is it some other explanation entirely? I do not know the answers, and I'm willing to admit and exist in an area where I don't know the answers. And if you're someone out there who wants to criticize someone for not knowing answers, then be my guest. If you already know everything, then what are you even doing here? Why are you even asking these questions? Well, I suppose only you can answer that. But what I'll leave you with on this very interesting and unique exploration is that you do have to seek your own answers. No one can do it for you, and maybe you find it easier to accept the answers that others have sought, and if you do, I'm happy for you, and I hope you find comfort and solace in doing that. But for others, there is something to be said for seeking your own answers, for constantly looking and constantly exploring all these unique mysteries that we have. I myself am both terrified and reassured that there are still many mysteries in our reality, that we have not yet explained everything. And I believe that is one of the
fundamental functions of our existence here. And it doesn't really matter in that respect whether this is a reality, a simulation, or everything in between. We ultimately have to find our own answers, and maybe you believe that others have found those answers for you. Maybe you believe that the divine answers are found in Revelations, and maybe they are correct. Ultimately, I'll leave it to you. And I am open to all different forms and explanations, because I think only by considering all of them will we find the answers that we seek. But what are your thoughts? What do you think is the reality behind the ant people? Did they really exist? Are they simply the product of a legend? Are they divine beings? Are they actually humans that had some sort of advanced technology? Or are they something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.